Isaac only meant to drop off a few old supplies at the rescue center. But the moment he saw the German Shepherd labeled G06 sitting quietly, back turned toward the light, something deep within him stirred. The dog didn't ask for anything, didn't signal in the usual ways. He simply existed, as if waiting for someone who had once lost their way. And on the very first rainy night they spent together, something unexpected unfolded. Something that left everyone at Granite Bend completely still. Morning in Granite Bend came wrapped in a pale silver mist, fine and powdery like salt clinging to the rim of a cold glass. The road leading into the rescue center was no more than a reddish dirt path, streaked with muddy tire marks and crisscrossed with paw prints of every size. The wind moved through the fir trees lining the hillsides, spinning dry leaves into brief, trembling spirals before letting them fall softly to the ground, as if each leaf were whispering something only the earth could understand. Isaac Thorne pulled his old, dust-veiled tan pickup into the front parking area. He cut the engine but stayed seated for a moment. On the passenger seat lay a canvas bag holding a few thick jackets, a sealed birthing kit, and a small steel bowl once used by the old medic team. Above the gate hung a weather-worn wooden sign with fading white letters, Granite Bend Animal Refuge, a place to begin again. But Isaac hadn't come to begin anything. He was only here to drop things off, just like everything else he did. Quick, simple, clean of emotion. They had a need. He had the means. That was enough. The metal gate gave a soft creak as it swung open. Inside stretched a wide yard divided into mesh kennels, each marked by a handwritten name tag, scattered toys, water bowls, and the layered chorus of barking. A husky sprang up at the sight of him. Two retrievers tussled over a plastic bone, and in the far corner, a cluster of volunteers laughed while clearing out straw bedding. Isaac placed the bag on the intake counter. The girl behind the desk looked barely over 20, her hair tied high, wearing a blue t-shirt that read, "Bend Kind." She thanked him with genuine warmth and asked politely if he'd like to walk through the adoption wing or if he was just stopping by. He almost said no, but instead he nodded. Maybe it was the way the sunlight felt softer today. Or maybe he just didn't feel like going back home yet. They walked along a narrow concrete corridor, sunlight filtering through gaps between the metal roofing and wire walls, casting long lines on the floor like the faint breath marks of a sleeping afternoon. Each kennel held a different world. Nursing mothers, dogs missing a leg or blind in one eye, and those simply too old to draw notice anymore. Each one had their own way of asking for affection, jumping, whining, pawing at the bars, or just staring with eyes that held stories no one had listened to. And then they reached the final cage. The girl pointed toward an enclosure with 3 solid walls, open only in front. "This one's new, no name yet. We've been calling it G06 after the kennel code. 6 months old, pure German Shepherd. Was sent to a training program but got returned for not meeting reflex standards. Hasn't acted out, but hasn't responded either." The kennel was quiet. No pawing, no barking, no wagging. Just a German Shepherd sitting with its back turned to the mesh gate, the light catching only the slope of its spine and the bend of one ear. Isaac stopped. Something moved faintly across his chest. Not recognition, but something close. The dog didn't turn, didn't flinch at footsteps. But when Isaac crouched to eye level, the dog turned its head, slowly, like the motion itself had once led to something bad. Its eyes didn't shine the way most dogs did. They weren't dull or vacant either. They were eyes that had seen too much without understanding, and had never been given the words to make sense of it. Their gazes met, nothing dramatic, but neither looked away. The wind stirred through the corridor, lifting the fur around the dog's neck. Isaac noticed its front legs crossed tightly, as if bracing itself from drifting off, not trembling, not tense, just holding on. The girl spoke softly. "Would you like to try taking it out to the yard? Just to see how it reacts." Isaac didn't answer at first. Then he stood, unlatched the kennel gate. The lock clicked quietly, unnoticed by the dog. Isaac didn't step forward. He simply sat on the kennel's threshold, shoulder at the dog's eye level. 1 minute, then 2, then 3. No one said anything. The dog stayed still, but it no longer faced away. It looked up, not with suspicion or hope, but as if wondering, what is this person going to do next? Isaac didn't touch its collar, didn't pull a leash. He only opened his palm and placed it on the floor, his scarred palm marked by war, once soaked in both blood and dust. And Riven, though not yet named, took a step. Just one. Slow, as if asking permission. But he came closer. Not all the way. Just close enough for the sunlight to fall into his eyes. And in that light, Isaac saw it clearly. The loneliness in this creature wasn't something to fix. It was something to understand. That day, Isaac left with nothing but an old fabric leash and a 7-day hold slip. But when he opened the truck door and the dog climbed in on its own, settling on the back seat without scratching, without seeking, he knew something had begun. Not a fresh start, but a quiet pact between two beings with no other choice, left but to walk a stretch of road together, just to see if anything left could still be held on to. Isaac's wooden house sat on the western edge of town, separated from the nearest neighbor by a patch of low pine forest. From the front porch, you could see the plain stretching wide with morning mist, where the fog wove silver threads through the grass like silk brushed gently across memory. Neighbors sometimes called it the Peace House, but Isaac knew the truest peace in that house came from the silence. The wall clock ticked on steadily, as if unaware that every night there came a moment when everything stopped, precisely at 2 a.m. Isaac woke without an alarm, without a sound. His body remembered that hour as instinct. The amber glow of the nightlight slanted across the pillow still damp with sweat. He sat up, back resting against the wooden wall. His eyes weren't fogged by sleep, nor strained by tension. They were simply hollow, the kind of hollowness only seen in people who had made it home from war. Fallujah. 5 years ago. Isaac never mentioned the name in conversation, yet it lived in every sharp breath, every flashing siren passing down the road, every hiss of a beer can opening. It was where his unit, 6 men who once laughed between radio chatter and static, disappeared in a blink when the roadside bomb went off. He was the only one found still breathing, face down beneath the charred frame of the vehicle. No one knew why he survived. Not even him. What followed was a long recovery, physical therapy for his left leg, psychological therapy for dreams that never found an ending, and the endless nights when those final images returned. Not in blood or screams, but in glances. The last look they gave before vanishing. Quiet, fast, without time for goodbyes. Once, someone had asked, "What does being the only one left alive feel like?" He had simply replied, "It doesn't feel like being alive." That morning, Isaac headed to the VA clinic for his biannual checkup. His therapist, Martha, was a woman in her 50s with a voice as light as gift wrap, but eyes steady enough to meet any panic head-on. The room was unchanged. Brown leather chairs, a rough wooden coffee table, a window overlooking the winter-stripped garden. Martha poured tea for them both, though Isaac never touched his. He sat with hands interlocked, eyes fixed on a squirrel leaping between branches and the porch roof outside. Martha opened with the usual line. "How was this past week?" Isaac didn't answer right away. He knew if he waited long enough, Martha wouldn't repeat the question. She never pushed, just waited. Eventually, he said quietly, "I woke up at 2. Like always." Martha scribbled a few notes, then looked up. "Have you tried recording your dreams?" "There's nothing to record. They're always the same." "How same, exactly?" Isaac lifted his gaze but didn't move it from the window. "I walk through the door, and they're no longer there." Silence stretched between them. Then Martha spoke, her voice gentle, like telling a story. "I once worked with a soldier named Garrett. He also woke at the same hour each night. Same dream, same place. But something changed when he brought home a rescue dog. The dream didn't vanish, but it stopped having control over him." Isaac frowned slightly, said nothing. Martha continued. "We're exploring emotional regulation through animal bonds. Not therapy dogs in the traditional sense. No training, no roles to fulfill. Just a living presence in the home. Something that breathes, that exists, that doesn't ask for explanations." He didn't nod, but he didn't dismiss it either. It was the first time he didn't cut her off mid-sentence. Martha placed a small brochure on the table. On its cover, a German shepherd rested its head on the lap of an elderly man, eyes closed, chest rising with calm breath. "I know a place. It's called Granite Bend, not far from here. You don't have to adopt. Just visit." Isaac picked up the paper, folded it once, slid it into his jacket pocket. The session ended like all the others. Martha walked him to the door, saying nothing more. But in the parking lot, he noticed a short-haired dog lying beneath a tree, beside a man in a wheelchair. The wind gently moved the dog's tail, not in excitement, but like it was steadying both of them with each soft sweep. Isaac stood watching for a long time, long enough that the man looked up, gave a slight nod, as if understanding what Isaac hadn't said. That night, Isaac didn't fall asleep right away. He pulled the brochure from his coat and laid it on the kitchen table. Under the lamp's pale light, he stared at the gray-scale image and quietly wondered, could a creature that doesn't speak, that knows nothing of war, still manage to hold on to something we humans keep losing? The next morning, he drove to Granite Bend. By the time the old brown pickup turned off the dirt road and into the yard, the sun had already passed its peak. The sunlight streamed sideways through bare branches, casting long golden threads across the ground, soft, still, and bright. In the back of the truck, Riven sat quietly like a sculpted shadow, not barking, not whining, not chewing on anything. The leash remained clipped around his neck, not taut, not slack, as if both of them were learning how to accept each other without needing to know where it all began. Isaac opened the back door, slowly. He stood there for a few moments, letting the familiar air of the yard seep through his coat, into his hair, just to be sure he hadn't imagined it, that the creature now sitting behind him was real, and not something from a midday dream. Riven didn't need to be called. When Isaac stepped up onto the porch, the dog leapt down from the truck bed without a sound. All 4 paws touched the ground as softly as fresh snow. He didn't sniff around like curious dogs do, nor did he glance left or right. He simply followed Isaac like a walking shadow, so quietly that if one didn't turn around to check, it would be easy to think he had vanished into thin air. The wooden door creaked open, revealing the warmth of the cabin inside, the low breath of the fireplace still glowing in the hearth. The walls were scrubbed clean, and old framed photographs of the former squad still hung in their usual spots. The dining table sat bare, with 2 chairs facing each other, though no one had ever taken the second seat. Isaac slipped off his boots and stepped onto the polished wooden floor. He didn't speak, didn't gesture. He simply waited. Riven stood at the threshold for a long moment, then stepped in, not with hesitation, and not because he was invited, but as if this place wasn't new, just quiet. In that first hour, Riven never moved far from the kitchen. He chose a shadowed corner, tucked between the table leg and the wall where no window light reached, and settled there. No whining, no shifting. His eyes stayed open, focused on some invisible point in the distance, as if guarding something unseen. Isaac poured himself a glass of water and placed a clean steel bowl beside the water tray. Inside was a scoop of fresh kibble, untouched. Riven didn't move. Isaac didn't coax him. He just rested his hand on the table, his gaze drifting over the clear surface of the glass before landing on the stretched shadow beneath the chair, where the tip of Riven's tail occasionally stirred when a breeze passed through the doorway gap. The house was still in a strange, unspoken way. No hum of a ceiling fan, no background music, no chatter or everyday noise often found in lived-in homes, only the faint crackle of burning wood and the soft breath of a dog, quieter than wind brushing over young grass. That evening, Isaac turned on the lamp in the living room. He sat with an old book open on his lap, though his eyes didn't truly follow the lines. Riven remained under the table, shifting position now and then, but never leaving the hollowed-out space he had claimed. When the clock neared midnight, Isaac stood and glanced toward the floor. Riven met his gaze. He didn't lower his head or blink, just held the look, long and unhurried, like a silent period at the end of a long sentence. Isaac opened the bedroom door, stepped inside, and left the porch light on through the night. It was the first time another living being was in the house, but it didn't disrupt the rhythm. The home remained just as still as it always had been, yet no longer felt empty. The next morning, golden sunlight touched the porch, spilling like honey onto the tabletop. Isaac awoke at 2, as usual, but without the jolt, without the sweat. Just a habit the body hadn't unlearned yet. He walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. Under the table, Riven was still there, eyes open, unmoving, watching him, not with hesitation nor with expectation, only as if confirming that nothing had gone missing during the night. Isaac gently pulled out a chair and sat, the glass warm in his hands. Outside the window, a thin mist melted between pine branches. The early breeze wasn't cold enough to sting, just enough to ripple the blanket draped over the edge of the sofa. The dog needed no comfort, and Isaac didn't need someone to tell him everything will be all right. They simply existed in the same space, where no one asked, "Where did you come from?" or "How long will you stay?" There was only presence, and presence, sometimes, is the first thing needed to begin again, even if neither of them dared to admit they were trying to. 7 a.m. Sunlight angled through the east-facing glass, spreading golden streaks over the wood counter, the sink, and the chair where Isaac usually had his morning coffee. Riven still lay under the table, curled in on himself, eyes half open, as if never fully released from alertness. The kettle let out a soft whistle. Isaac, with his back turned to the dog, stirred a spoon in a mug of black tea, the gentle chime of metal against ceramic filling the silence. He didn't look over, but his voice broke the hush, low, steady, like a thought spoken out loud. "I used to hate silence. Every time the radio cut out, my heart would race, afraid someone out there had disappeared before I could hear them go." Riven didn't move, but his ears shifted slightly toward the sound. Isaac sat down, placing the mug on the table. The morning light highlighted the old scuff marks in the wood, remnants of dropped knives or fists slammed too hard. His gaze drifted out the window, where the patch of grass in the yard was drying slowly under the rising sun, as if someone were gently brushing off the dust of time. But after that, I couldn't stand noise anymore. Slamming doors, clattering metal, Engines backfiring, every sound became a reminder of what was lost, of what I couldn't name. Beneath the table, Riven stretched one leg forward. Not a reaction, just the slow extension of a body starting to trust a place where danger didn't live. Isaac smiled faintly, unconsciously. He didn't expect a wagging tail, didn't need an eager look, only needed a creature that listened, or at least one that didn't leave. That afternoon, Isaac began clearing out the bookshelf in the corner of the living room. Old mission notebooks, pinned-up maps, folded certificates once stuffed carelessly into drawers. He sorted through them all, not because he needed the space, but because he no longer needed to look away. Riven had been watching everything from beneath the table. He hadn't stepped out, but his head tilted slightly, ears pricking every time Isaac dropped something. There was no growling, no flinching, only the stillness of a creature quietly gauging whether the world around it was safe. That evening, when Isaac laid out dinner, a plate of rice, a portion of steamed vegetables, and a small tray of dry dog food, he spoke again, not looking at anyone in particular. Back then, I used to think, if someone had been beside me, maybe I wouldn't have chosen silence for all those years. But I've learned, it's not just about having someone there. It has to be someone who doesn't ask, who doesn't wait for answers, who just stays. Riven didn't eat, but he looked at the food. A longer look than usual. Not longing, but as if recognizing that something was being offered, and it was waiting, without pressure. That night, Isaac still woke at 2 a.m. But this time, he didn't sit up in a panic. He simply lay on his side, eyes open, listening to the wind slipping past the metal roof outside. And then he heard something new. Soft, subtle, the faint tap of claws brushing gently against the wooden floor. Riven didn't bark. He stepped out from under the table, paws moving like whispers. He didn't come to the bedroom door. He didn't try to climb the bed. He just sat at the threshold, where the dim light from the night lamp reached far enough to reveal the small, quiet silhouette that was very much alive. Isaac turned his head. Their eyes met. Nothing more was needed. The next morning, when Isaac opened his eyes, the doorway was empty. But on the floor beside his foot, caught in the angle of fresh sunlight, lay a single brown hair. The first 7 days passed with no obvious changes. Riven didn't come closer, didn't bark, didn't eat if watched. But each day he left the table's shadow a little earlier. Each night he slept a little nearer to the bedroom door. His ears remained alert a little longer when Isaac moved between rooms. And Isaac kept brewing tea as usual, speaking as if retelling old memories to no one. He talked about a forest run with his unit, where a fake bear call sent them sprinting 3 miles through trees, laughing until their ribs ached. He spoke of a teammate named Renner, who once studied art, but couldn't bear to sit still long enough to finish school. So he went to war instead. And when Isaac recalled the moment Renner set down his weapon mid-battle to rescue a stray dog trapped in a bomb crater, Riven, for the first time, didn't look away. That was all. Not a breakthrough, but a step. A very small step, soundless. But enough to let a man know that in the quietest of footsteps, there might still be an answer. Nights in Granite Bend had a strange kind of silence. No car horns, no bar music drifting from across town. Just wind weaving through brittle branches and the soft, lonely calls of owls in the black woods. To Isaac, that silence was both reward and burden. It sharpened everything, even the things no one wanted to remember. It was the 11th night since Riven had come home. The wall clock read 2:03. The bedroom was awash in faint amber glow from the nightlight, as weak as dying embers. Isaac turned over. Sweat clung to his back. His breathing was sharp, eyes wide. For a split second, he thought he was back in Fallujah, the collapsed bunker, dust and blood mixing in his throat, voices calling from somewhere unreachable. Then he sat up, reaching out on instinct. The glass vial on the nightstand shattered against the wood with a sharp crack. Then silence. Complete silence. No alarms, no shouting, just him and the surge of panic that sliced through the dark like a blade. Isaac braced himself on the pillow, breath coming in bursts, hands clasped so tight his knuckles turned white. His forehead dropped, sweat soaking into the sheet. No more war, no more teammates, but the images. They remained, vivid, immediate, and never truly gone. He didn't hear the claws on the floor, didn't feel the approach. Only when something soft, warm, and impossibly light touched the back of his hand did he startle and lift his gaze. Riven! The dog lay just inches away. No bark, no growl, no retreat, not even direct eye contact. He simply pressed his muzzle to Isaac's hand again, gentle, like a gesture from a world that didn't need explanations. Isaac looked at him for a long while, his breath still ragged, but his heartbeat slowed. His hand, one that had held rifles, tied bandages, gripped dying men, was now being touched by a creature that carried nothing but presence. He reached out. Riven didn't pull away, didn't move closer, just remained, as if silence itself had become the answer. Isaac let his hand rest against the fur of Riven's neck, warm, thick, steady enough to make a man forget his fingers were still trembling. And for the first time in years, Isaac cried. Not loudly, not broken, just tears, quiet and unannounced, sliding down his cheek, along his chin, soaking into his shirt. No one saw. No one asked why. Only one creature stayed. Unmoving. Unjudging. Isaac spoke then, voice hoarse like a long-held truth finally rising to the surface. I wasn't trying to survive. I just didn't die fast enough to go with them. Riven didn't answer, but he lifted his head and shifted closer, resting just beside Isaac's leg. And in that moment there was no war, no line between rescuer and rescued, only two living beings, both carrying invisible fractures, learning for the first time what it meant not to be alone. After a while, Isaac stood up and went to fetch a cloth to clean the broken glass. Riven followed him, slowly, as if watching over the man in case he might collapse in the middle of the room. Isaac sat back on the edge of the bed. Riven lay directly at his feet. Sleep didn't return, but sleep wasn't needed. Just the simple knowledge that if he woke again at 2 a.m., someone would be there. Not to understand everything, just to be there. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window like a gentle embrace. Isaac stepped into the kitchen and switched on the kettle. Riven lay near the table, eyes closed, but ears twitching slightly at the sound of familiar footsteps. Isaac brewed his tea and placed a fresh bowl of kibble on the floor. When he turned around, he caught sight of Riven leaning toward the dish, sniffing it gently. He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth curved slightly, a shape his face hadn't remembered how to make in years. For the first time in a very long time, Isaac felt something without a name, something not yet happiness, but perhaps the beginning of it. A beginning so small it could be missed, like a gentle touch in the middle of the night. That same morning, before sunlight even reached the kitchen window, the lights in the cabin were already on. Isaac had woken at his usual time, brewed a cup of black tea like he always did. But this time, his hands didn't tremble. And in the quiet kitchen, the sound of water filling the kettle felt closer, clearer, like silence itself had grown deeper. He placed the food bowl in its usual spot beside the table leg. Riven was already there, no longer tucked into shadows. His ears were up before the bowl even touched the floor, and a second later, he rose to his feet. There was no hesitation, no sidelong glance. Riven stepped fully into the amber circle cast by the kitchen lamp. For the first time, the light touched the white patch on his chest, fur like a brushstroke on a canvas painted too long in grays. Isaac stood a few paces away, saying nothing, just watching. No expectations, no deep breath, only the quiet hope that his eyes might finally witness something his heart had feared he'd never see. Riven lowered his head, touched his nose to the kibble. He didn't eat immediately, but he didn't back away. One slow breath, one soft lick of the lips. Then he began chewing. Small bites, careful, steady. Isaac didn't look away, but instead of staying there, he turned and opened the cupboard near the fireplace. In the corner sat a small wooden box, its surface dusted with time. He wiped it clean, gently, and lifted the lid. Inside, a folded flag medal, a worn steel dog tag with half-faded letters, a torn piece of fabric still stiff with dried mud, and a yellowed photo of the unit taken the day before their final deployment. Each time he had looked at these, time seemed to freeze, trapping the ache before it had a chance to speak. But today, he didn't linger. He wrapped the items with care and placed the box on the lowest shelf, where no light reached. Not forgetting, just putting them away. Like how people sometimes store what once was pain, so it may quietly become a part of memory, without demanding explanation. When he returned to the kitchen, Riven had finished eating. He was sitting, not in shadow, but in the glow beside the table, where the warm kitchen light cast down on the floor like a never-fading beam of morning. Isaac pulled out a chair and sat down. The tea in his hand had gone cold, but he didn't mind. His eyes moved along the lines etched into the tabletop, marks from long-ago meals with friends after training runs. Now, in that same place, a quiet creature looked back at him, not afraid, not forced. Two beings, side by side, no words, no performance, no need to fill the silence with anything but presence. Then Isaac spoke, without planning to. The words came like a breath that finally carried weight. I used to think silence was a sign of breaking, but maybe there's a kind of silence that doesn't break. Riven didn't respond, but his ears shifted slightly, not reacting, just listening. Outside, the sky slowly warmed. Natural light crept through the wooden slats, gently pushing the glow of the kitchen lamp into retreat. But inside the small house, nothing needed to change. Isaac sat still. Riven remained nearby. No one needed to take another step forward that morning, because the moment itself had already moved them. A beginning didn't need fanfare. Sometimes it was just an empty bowl licked clean, a wooden box placed away, and a glance that lingered a little longer than it used to. Morning of the 13th day. The sky over Granite Bend was a quiet blue, serene and wide. Wisps of cloud floated like veils of mist over the treetops, leaving plenty of space for sunlight to thread its way down the hillside pines. In the little kitchen, Isaac made tea. The kettle's steady boil rose, then faded when he flicked the switch. Riven lay nearby, not asleep, but no longer on alert. The space between them wasn't distance anymore. It was presence, shared, unspoken, and finally, unforced. Isaac set his teacup down on the table and walked toward the glass door that opened to the backyard. His hand paused on the wooden handle, not in hesitation, but with the quiet deliberation of someone checking if they were truly ready for something that wouldn't repeat itself. The door opened with a soft creak. Not sharp, not disruptive, but like a small voice announcing that something had shifted. Morning air swept in, carrying the scent of damp soil, the musk of old wood along the fence, and a faint trace of pine resin rising from the tall trees. Sunlight streamed low through the branches, spreading across the stone patio like golden water poured from the sky. Riven flinched, not from fear, but from the keen alertness of a creature long accustomed to shadow, now being gently invited into the light. He rose and stepped closer to the door, then stopped. His eyes stayed fixed on the yard ahead, where sunlight had painted every stone in a warm sheen. A light breeze stirred the fur around his neck, making it ripple ever so slightly. Isaac didn't speak, didn't call. He simply stood in the doorway, one hand resting on the frame, waiting. No coaxing, no commands, just a silent invitation, like a gate left open for whoever might want to cross. Riven sat down. He didn't retreat, didn't advance, just sat at the threshold, between inside and out, between what had been and what could be. His gaze didn't settle on Isaac or the yard. It lingered somewhere in between, as if weighing something invisible. Minutes passed, and then, without sound, without ceremony, Riven lifted one paw and placed it on the first step. The sunlight touched his jet-black claws. It didn't sting. It didn't overwhelm. It was simply new, cool to the touch, but free of threat. Isaac stepped back, moved aside, did nothing but make space. Riven stepped down again, and then his whole body stood within the circle of morning light, where the ground was still damp from the night before, but not enough to chill a creature that was learning, slowly, to trust the world again. Isaac sat on the step. The teacup still warmed his palm. His eyes never left Riven, the dog now standing still in the yard, no longer a shadow clinging to walls. Riven turned his head. The look wasn't searching, wasn't pleading, but neither was it closed off. Isaac patted the empty step beside him. No command, just a quiet suggestion. That space was open if Riven wanted it. He didn't come right away. But seconds later, that large body began to move. Not fast, not wary, just gradually, one slow step at a time, as if walking across pieces of memory only he could see. And then, Riven sat. Right beside Isaac. Not touching, not leaning, but close enough to share the same patch of sunlight. A breeze whispered by, dry leaves scattered across the patio. Somewhere off in the trees, a squirrel darted between branches, but neither of them moved. They remained as they were, still, grounded, like two statues placed exactly where they needed to be. In that moment, Isaac wasn't thinking about war, not about loss, not about the nights that dragged him awake in a sweat. He was only watching the trees sway overhead, feeling the sun settle softly on his shoulders, and listening to the breath of a creature who was no longer a stranger. No one said anything. But the silence didn't feel empty. Because once you've sat with someone in the light of a new morning, you're never truly alone again. Rain came on the afternoon of the second Monday. Not the heavy, lashing kind brought by storms, but a soft, scattered drizzle, fine droplets falling one by one, steady and persistent. Each drop passed through the canopy, tapped gently on the tin roof, and slid down the edge of the wooden awning like the quiet applause of an unseen audience, watching something intimate unfold. Isaac stood in the doorway, teacup in hand, steam fogging the lower edge of his glasses. He didn't call out, didn't wave, didn't speak. He simply stood there, watching as Riven moved slowly across the yard, in the rain. No leash, no commands, no expectant gaze. Just a creature who had once shrunk from even the subtlest change, now placing each paw on the damp ground, letting the rain soak gently into his fur. Riven wandered toward the corner of the yard, where water pooled around the base of low-growing grass. His eyes didn't track any particular sound. His body didn't stiffen with defense. His paws landed so steadily on the stones that they didn't even make a sound. Isaac leaned lightly against the doorframe and drew in a deep breath. The smell of rain blended with wild grass behind the house, and for a moment he was back in early morning drills under fog, back in fields of churned mud, but also in those rare afternoons when the entire unit just sat in silence, listening to rain fall through leaves. He had once hated rain, because its sound always reminded him of things spiraling beyond control. But now, as he watched Riven step through a shallow puddle and pause by a young maple growing beside the fence, there was no weight in his chest. Riven lowered his head and sniffed the base of the tree. There was nothing remarkable in the gesture. And yet to Isaac, it marked something he'd never dared hope to see. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom that comes when a creature is let out of a cage, but the kind that grows quietly inside the mind. Riven no longer clung to walls, no longer avoided the light, no longer used silence as a shield. Instead, he stood in a calm that wasn't born from fear, but from peace. A single drop of rain slid from Isaac's hair down the back of his neck. He didn't wipe it away. He simply smiled, small, genuine, the kind of smile that didn't carry pain in its shadow. Riven turned his head. It wasn't the look of one awaiting a command, nor the wary glance of one unsure. He looked, as if to ask, "Can I keep going?" Isaac said nothing, just tilted his head slightly, eyes shining beneath the soft shimmer of rain. And Riven moved forward again. Across the yard, a few wet leaves dropped under the pull of wind. Riven paused, lifted his head, and let the diagonal drizzle strike his face. His ears twitched, but they didn't fold. His back stayed straight. Not proud, but unafraid. Isaac watched with a quiet release in his chest, an easing that didn't have a name, like seeing a loved one smile again after a long stretch of sorrow. Not because the pain had vanished, but because their body had finally chosen to stand tall in the open, without needing to hide behind anyone anymore. Rain kept falling. Soft, steady. Riven began to walk in a circle, revisiting the familiar corners, the tree roots, the broken ceramic pot, the mossy rug of green beneath the fence. He didn't rush, he didn't run, but every step held quiet certainty, as if the ground beneath him no longer felt foreign. Isaac set the cup on the step and sat, his arms folded across his chest. His eyes didn't leave the figure moving through the yard, the creature who, for so long, had lived in shadow and was now stepping out of it. And in that rain, in the backyard of a forgotten wooden house on a hillside, a man once broken by war and a dog once silenced by fear simply lived. No restraints, no miracles, just a shared glance and a gentle rain. Night 15 in Granite Bend. The small cabin nestled on the slope had begun to warm with new routines. Footsteps no longer pressed against walls, the soft clink of dishes in the kitchen, and quiet mornings where two beings sat together beneath the porch, watching mist dissolve. That evening, the sky cleared. The early month moon wasn't full, but it was bright. Isaac laid down his notebook. The desk lamp cast a muted golden hue across his cheekbones, now sharpened again with time. The light didn't glare. It didn't disturb the quiet. It merely held the room in a warm presence that resisted the cold. Riven lay outside the hallway. From his spot, he could peer through the cracked door and see Isaac's shadow fall across the wall, watch the steady light, and hear the soft rustle of paper. Steady, undramatic. Isaac sat there a while, still. And then, as if something stirred from deep within, he turned his head and looked towards the bedroom door, the door that had remained closed since the day he came back from Fallujah. Not out of fear of intruders, not out of mistrust, but habit, the instinct of someone who once lived where every breeze through a crack might have been the prelude to disaster. He stood up and walked to that door. His hand rested lightly on the wooden latch. Then let go. No lock. He simply pushed the door open a little wider, just enough for Riven, if he wished, to come in. Then Isaac returned to bed, leaving the light off, and the door ajar. Night air slipped softly through the window. Moonlight spilled across the floor, scattering in pale ribbons like quiet paths leading to somewhere distant and unnamed. Isaac lay on his side, eyes not yet closed. His heartbeat was steadier than in those early nights, though his body still hadn't quite made peace with the weight of an unlocked door. A few minutes later, the soft sound of Paws met the wood. Not hurried, not sharp. Just quiet, solid steps, like something once fractured was slowly mending. Riven entered. He didn't scan the room, didn't sniff. He simply walked to the foot of the bed, turned once, and lay down, as if that spot had always belonged to him, only never properly claimed. Isaac didn't move, but his breath grew lighter. Not because he was asleep, but because, for the first time in a long time, his body had nothing left to guard against. They lay there, one in each corner. No words, no contact, but between them, something had quietly been undone, like a latch no longer dividing two worlds of solitude. The night passed slowly. Wind stirred the trees outside. Leaves whispered like background music composed only for those who had known loss. Close to 2 a.m., Isaac shifted in his sleep. Moonlight still filtered in through the window. And at the moment he opened his eyes, he found Riven's gaze meeting his. The dog was awake, eyes half open, not tense, not watchful. Just present, not watching over, not awaiting command, simply being. It wasn't a mask, it wasn't a reflex, it was a quiet affirmation that he was still there, still keeping vigil, still awake, not out of fear but from trust, connection, companionship. Isaac said nothing. He simply closed his eyes. Slowly. As if that look alone had told him everything he needed to know, that tonight he could sleep, truly. That morning, the Granite Bend sky hung heavy like a veil of mist that hadn't quite lifted. Isaac slipped on a light coat, shut the truck door with quiet care. Riven sat in the yard, not barking, not asking to come along. Just watching, a gaze unburdened, unafraid. Isaac's hand rested on the steering wheel. The cold of it steadied something deep inside. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since Riven entered his life. Little by little, the fractures in his memory had begun to form edges, to take shape, no longer spilling everywhere with force. He arrived at the town's medical center around 10 a.m. Dr. Powell, the one who had monitored him since the day he returned, smiled as he walked in. "You look better," she said, pouring tea as her eyes skimmed the aging folder. Isaac sat down, eyes settling on the stretch of wall between two bookcases. He didn't need to glance at charts or read diagnoses. For the first time in years, he had something to say back. "I brought him home," he said. "The dog?" "Yeah, his name's Riven." The doctor didn't ask further, just nodded, a quiet acknowledgement that she was listening. Isaac spoke, not fluently, not seamlessly, but honestly, about the first night the door wasn't locked, about the sound of Riven's paws walking the yard in the rain, about the first time the dog lay at the foot of the bed, eyes meeting his in the dark, without a single word. "He didn't do anything dramatic," Isaac smiled faintly, "but just being there, It felt like he understood. That is something dramatic, the doctor replied. With wounds like yours, sometimes presence without explanation is the only thing that keeps someone from disappearing inside themselves. They talked a little more about sleep, about whether Fallujah still visited his dreams. He nodded. It did. But he no longer woke gasping, no longer thrashed alone in the dark. On the drive home, light rain began to fall, droplets scattered across the windshield, forming blurred trails as the wipers passed. Isaac drove slowly. The radio played a soft, instrumental jazz track, the saxophone weaving like mist over the hills. Near the bend just before home, a pickup from a side road lost traction, its tail swerving briefly into Isaac's lane. He hit the brakes. The truck jolted, no impact. But the sudden jerk tensed every muscle. His heart raced. Not from the near miss, but from memory, the echoes of explosions, the first seconds after a blast, all came rushing back, sharp and uninvited. Isaac breathed hard, hands gripping the wheel, and then, from behind, a quiet pressure landed on his shoulder. Not heavy, not a brace, just a gentle lean. Riven had climbed into the back seat without a sound, and now his muzzle pressed lightly against Isaac's back. No bark, no panic, just a single point of warmth, as if to say, "I'm here." Isaac didn't turn around. He stayed just as he was, listening to the dog's quiet breathing behind him, letting that warmth soak through the fabric and fill the space between panic and clarity. After a while, he turned the ignition again. The truck rolled slowly forward, climbing the short slope that led into the yard. Rain still fell, steady as ever, but no longer blurred his view. He shut off the engine, leaned his head briefly against the steering wheel, then turned slightly. Riven was still there, unmoving, eyes fixed on him. Isaac spoke softly, not to the dog, not exactly to himself either. "It knows I need to hold on to something that doesn't vanish when everything else already has." The words needed no answer, because in the quiet look between them, what was being held on to had never been clearer. The Granite Ridge Veterans Recovery Center sat on the southern edge of town, tucked behind weeping willows and rows of wind-faded pines. Every Thursday, the center hosted evaluation sessions for dogs with the potential to become therapy companions, animals trained to sense, support, and intervene when their human partners experienced post-traumatic distress. Isaac never thought he'd bring Riven. But Dr. Powell had said, "Don't think of it as a test. Just a walk. Maybe it'll help you see what you've already got." So, that Thursday morning, Isaac clipped a leash onto Riven. For the first time in days, the dog hesitated. The leash must have meant something, maybe a symbol of something not chosen, not free. But when he saw that Isaac's eyes carried no command, no pressure, Riven stepped forward, quietly pressing his neck into the collar. It was a short drive, but silent. At the lot, other dogs had already arrived. Labradors, Goldens, Collies, all sitting obediently, tails wagging in sync like textbook candidates. Riven stepped down without a sound. He didn't pull. He didn't bark. But his eyes never left Isaac, like the entire world had narrowed to just one person, and that one person made him feel he belonged. Isaac signed in and waited. No one paid much attention. This was a place used to seeing new arrivals come and go, usually retreating once their dogs didn't fit the mold. The evaluation began. The trainer asked each dog to go through a set of tests, stopping on cue, remaining unfazed by loud noise, finding their handler in a crowd, lying still for 60 seconds without being told twice. Riven failed nearly all of them. He didn't stop at the sound of a whistle, didn't respond to a stranger's voice, ignored hand signals from staff. And when a ball bounced past the corridor, he merely turned his head, then looked back at Isaac, eyes steady, unblinking. One staff member quietly made a note. Another sighed, as if used to seeing unsuitable cases. But Isaac didn't speak. He wasn't disappointed. He wasn't embarrassed. He simply looked at Riven, who, though failing every prompt, had not taken his eyes off Isaac for a single moment. When it came to the find your person in a crowd exercise, they led Isaac outside, leaving Riven inside with a trainer. The idea was to see if he could seek Isaac out. Riven glanced around, clearly unsettled. But instead of rushing off, he walked to the edge of the doorway, sat down, and waited. Moments later, the door opened. Isaac stepped back in. Riven didn't leap, didn't run. He simply stood, walked forward, and lowered his head to touch Isaac's hand, as if to say, "I didn't need to search. I only needed to stay." At the end, the trainer turned to Isaac and shook her head gently. "This one's not suited for therapy work." Isaac smiled. Not bitter, not defensive, just a simple, honest smile, as if something had clicked at last. What he needed wasn't on any checklist. "I don't need him to do anything," he said, stroking Riven's back. "I just need him to stay." On the drive back, neither of them spoke, but the cab felt warmer, quieter, not because no expectations were broken, but because no test had ever been capable of measuring what they had already made it through. Near home, Isaac pulled over at the crest of the hill, where sunlight poured through young pine branches and stretched out in golden lines, like a path drawn straight into silence. He opened the truck door, said nothing, and Riven stepped out, without hesitation. They stood side by side, eyes turned toward the moss-covered trail they'd never walked before. "We don't need to pass anything," Isaac said quietly, eyes still on the path. "We just need not to let go of each other." Riven didn't respond, but his tail gave a soft sweep from side to side, just enough to say he'd heard, he understood, and he had chosen, without any certificate to prove it. That afternoon, the sky above Granite Ridge cleared with an unusual gentleness. Pale golden light coated the center's porch, like a soft promise that today would remain calm. Isaac brought Riven back to the center, not for testing this time, but for the regular gathering where veterans and their four-legged companions shared coffee, soft music, and quiet conversation. Riven walked beside him, no leash needed. Each step matched the rhythm of Isaac's shoes, not rushed, not slow, just steady, as if their breathing had synced long ago, without either one noticing when. The common room wasn't crowded. Former soldiers sat on wooden chairs, hands cupped around ceramic mugs, their eyes distant but still. Someone played a harmonica by the window. The tune had no name, but it carried the weight of sunsets on wide fields, slow, steady, and flowing like a river with no need for a destination. Isaac took a seat. Riven lay beside his chair. A few others glanced toward the dark-coated dog. Quiet, unreactive, but with eyes that always landed exactly where they needed to. And then, when no one expected it, the alarm blared. Shrill, piercing, slicing through the calm like a blade through cloth. To anyone who had once lived inside gunfire, that sound wasn't just noise, it was a trigger. A door flung open, letting memory flood in without warning. Isaac froze for a second, then collapsed. His body slumped sideways, hands shaking, breath shallow and sharp like someone trying not to drown. The siren didn't stop. His eyes were open but saw nothing. His ears registered sound but not words. Only blasts, screams, chaos. He was lost inside his past. Riven had been let out just before the doors locked for emergency protocol. He didn't understand the siren. Didn't understand why Isaac hadn't looked back. But he knew. Something was wrong. By instinct, Riven leapt from the bench outside, circling to the rear. All entrances were secured. He didn't hesitate. He jumped onto the hood of a nearby car, launched himself through the gap of an old van's open window, shattering the loose pane as he squeezed through, pushing open the door just wide enough to slip into the hallway. No one stopped him. Staff were too busy guiding people to safety. Riven ran down 3 corridors, took 1 turn, and stopped outside the common room, where Isaac lay collapsed, no one beside him. He charged forward, no teeth, no scratching, just his shoulder, pressed hard against the door. It gave way. The siren still screamed. Isaac lay on the floor, eyes wide, chest heaving, trapped somewhere only he could see, still fighting in a place the rest of the world had forgotten. Riven didn't rush to him. He paused. Then moved slowly forward, head lowered, paws soft as though afraid to shatter what remained of a man barely holding together. And then, with only inches left between them, Riven climbed atop him. Not pressing, just resting his chest against Isaac's, a steady, warm weight. He brought his muzzle close to Isaac's ear. Didn't bark, didn't whine, just breathed, long, calm, real, until that rhythm touched the panic still echoing in Isaac's chest. 1 second. Then 2, then 3, like a tether pulling a lost soul back from the flood. Isaac didn't know how long he'd been gone, trapped in that dark place, surrounded by voices, by smoke, by broken bodies. But the first thing he felt wasn't the ceiling lights. It was warmth, from a being that said nothing, asked nothing, but had waited. He placed his hand on the fur over Riven's heart, just enough to say, "I've returned." The alarm stopped 10 minutes later. The tech team confirmed a glitch in the fire suppression system. People filtered back in, anxious, chaotic, but inside that room, between Isaac and Riven, no one spoke. They simply looked at each other, a man who once carried a unit through war and a dog who once couldn't hold a stranger's gaze, now sitting together, as if born to mend each other's fractured pieces. A week after the incident at Granite Ridge, Isaac sat in his living room in front of the computer. Sunlight from the window traced a faint line across the sleeve of his gray sweater. Riven lay beneath the desk, head resting on Isaac's foot, breathing slow and steady, like the old kitchen clock ticking in the next room. A new notification lit up the screen. The headline read, "Untrained dog pulls veteran from panic. Emotional moment captured at Granite Ridge." Isaac clicked. The clip was just 2.5 minutes. No edits, no music, no effects. It opened with the siren, chaos spilling into frame, then cut to the backyard, where a dog dashed across the porch, through the corridor, shouldered open a door. Next came Riven, not the posture of a trained K9 hero, but a quiet, almost uncertain gait that never stopped. Step by step he made his way to Isaac, curled on the floor, wide-eyed and empty. Riven didn't do anything dramatic. He just pressed his body to Isaac's chest, and stayed. The moment Isaac's hand lifted to touch that fur, the video froze. White text appeared over black. A dog doesn't need to be trained to love. They only need to be trusted. No soundtrack, no visual effects. But when Isaac scrolled through the comments, the numbers were clear. Over 400,000 views, 2,700 shares, hundreds of messages, from all over the world, in different languages, different voices, all echoing the same truth. As a Navy vet who's broken down in my own front yard, I never thought anyone would understand until I saw that dog's eyes. We don't need to call it therapy to know what it just did. My kid used to hide under the desk for hours every time there was a loud sound, until our old stray walked up and simply laid beside him. The Western Veterans Association shared the video on their official page. Shortly after, a non-governmental PTSD support network reposted it with a caption that read, "A creature that never passed any formal test, yet crossed every instinctual boundary just to hold on to someone. 3 days later, Isaac received a call from a representative of the State Therapeutic Veterinary Council. "We'd like to meet Riven." The woman's voice wasn't rehearsed. It carried the tone of something quietly true. Not to evaluate, to acknowledge. There was no grand ceremony, no stage, no gold-framed certificate, just a long wooden table in a meeting room at the Community Psychological Center, a few representatives, a behavioral veterinarian, and a soldier no longer wearing a uniform, alongside a dog that carried no title, no badge, nothing but the name, Riven. "From this day forward," the team lead announced, "Riven is officially recognized as the first case in our state of an unofficial companion canine for veterans with PTSD, acknowledged solely by behavior, instinct, and a proven human bond." Isaac said nothing. He simply rested his hand on Riven's back, who sat quietly beside him, ears gently lowered, tail brushing the floor with each breath. A photographer took a picture. That afternoon, the local paper published it. A man in civilian clothes sitting still in a sunlit room, fingertips barely touching the shoulder of a German shepherd. No leash, no engraved tag, yet with eyes that said more than any medal ever could. That night, Isaac didn't turn the lights on when he got home. He sat on the porch, with Riven beside him, just like they had done every late afternoon lately. The wind from the hill carried the scent of young pines and a whisper of fallen leaves on the steps. The moon rose, thin as a crack across the sky, but bright enough to draw a line of light across the back of his hand, now resting on Riven's head. He murmured, barely above a whisper, not clear whether to himself or to the wind. "Not all good things start with a test." Riven shifted slightly. Didn't leave, just moved closer, as if to say, "I know." That morning, the sun arrived earlier than usual. A sliver of light, soft as a feather, slid through the curtain and stretched across the wooden floor where Riven lay. The kitchen clock ticked steadily. The kettle sang quietly. And Isaac, as he always did, prepared for a simple morning. Pale gray shirt, black coffee, and a notepad marked with therapy appointments. But something was different. Riven stayed still, didn't tuck under the table, didn't trail behind Isaac from room to room, didn't whimper at the sound of a zipper or a door handle. He simply lay there, head resting on a chair leg, ears gently raised, eyes wide open and calm, following each of Isaac's movements as he tied his shoes on the porch. And in that moment, Isaac realized it was the first time since they began living together that Riven wasn't anxious when he prepared to leave the house. No scratching the door, no panicked breathing, no pressing close like he was afraid the one he trusted might disappear. Just a look. Still steady. As if Riven understood. And believed. Isaac paused, one hand frozen mid-knot. He turned and met that gaze, not pleading, not desperate, just waiting, not for someone to stay, but for someone to come back. Since the day of the alarm incident, Isaac's mind had undergone a quiet shift. Not drastic, but enough to make things feel less disoriented. He could now distinguish between the sound of street sirens and the alarms buried in memory. His mornings were no longer split at 2 a.m. Dinners, though often just eggs and toast, were no longer left uneaten halfway through. One morning, while walking along the forest edge behind his house, Isaac tried something he hadn't dared before. He unclipped Riven's leash. Riven didn't bolt, didn't freeze. He simply walked a few steps ahead, turning back from time to time, like saying, "I'm still near." And in that space, bathed in sunlight and rustling leaves, Isaac understood that this wasn't about fear anymore. It was trust, born from freedom. Riven didn't know the command, "sit," and he'd never properly responded to "down." But Riven knew when Isaac needed silence, when he needed warmth, and when he needed a reason to step back into the light. No one had taught him that. There was no course, no certificate, just a heart, and a patience that was never asked for but offered anyway. That morning, as Isaac reached for the door handle, he stopped and turned back. He walked over to Riven, crouched down, and gently ran his hand along the dog's back, from the shoulder blades down to the hips, pausing behind the ear, where the fur was just a bit thicker, a bit softer, and always the warmest during chilly mornings. "It's just a short meeting," he whispered. "I'll be back before lunch." Riven didn't growl, didn't whimper. He blinked, lifted his head slightly, and rested his chin on Isaac's knee. A brief gesture, but it spoke more than any sound ever could. And to Isaac, it felt like a promise that needed no words. "I know. I'll wait." When the door closed behind him, the house held no footsteps, no clinks of mugs on the stove, no scrape of chairs, yet it didn't feel empty the way it once had. Only sunlight stretched in from the side window, casting a soft layer of golden warmth across Riven's back, like an invisible blanket for souls that had quietly chosen to stay. Isaac stepped onto the porch, slid into the driver's seat, and glanced in the rearview mirror. Behind the curtain, barely visible, the shape of Riven remained still, unchanged. And Isaac understood. Trust didn't need leashes. Understanding didn't need commands. Only time. And a kind of affection quiet enough to hear what was never spoken aloud. The community room sat at the far end of a gray brick building tucked beneath maple trees that had begun their quiet shift into fall. Wooden chairs were arranged in a wide circle, and at the center, a low table held a pot of hot tea and several mismatched ceramic mugs. None of them new, none quite the same, but all clean and warm to the touch. Isaac took one of those chairs on a Friday afternoon. It wasn't raining, but no one would have called it sunny either. Just a gentle kind of light filtering through the leaves, spreading in soft patches across the floor. Not sharp, but clear enough for everyone to see one another. Riven lay close to Isaac's feet. No leash, no command. The dog had chosen his usual spot, right beside Isaac's right leg, resting his head on a pair of worn canvas shoes, his gaze fixed forward, but never drifting far from the man beside him. No one in the circle asked about the dog, at least not at first. Then the sharing began, quietly, like ripples spreading across still water. An older man spoke of a recurring dream where he could hear his squad's voices but never see their faces. A young woman, once stationed at a frontline base, described the suffocating weight of walking into a crowded supermarket. Another man only said 3 words, "I still breathe," then fell silent. When it came to Isaac, he spoke plainly. "I used to think I had to fix myself, but maybe I just needed to learn how to live with the parts that no longer fit." No one interrupted. No one added applause to fill the silence. Just a deep breath. And a small, quiet nod from the person across the circle. Riven remained still. No shift in posture. No nervous twitch. He didn't need to understand every word. As long as Isaac's breathing stayed steady, Riven would be there, like solid ground that no one asked for, but somehow everyone needed. When the session came to a close, people stood, poured more tea, traded a few words about the weather, or lightly tapped one another's shoulders, as if to say, without saying it, "I know. I've been there too." Isaac leaned down, brushed his fingers gently behind Riven's ear. "Let's go," he whispered. The dog stood, no hesitation, no tension. He simply rose, because the person he trusted was ready to walk. Just as they turned to leave the room, a voice called out from behind. "Hey!" Isaac turned. It was the man sitting across the circle, maybe in his early 50s, hair graying in patches, shoulders sagging in an old army jacket. "How do you get a dog like that?" he asked, not with awe, but something more honest, like he wasn't asking about a dog at all, but about a chance. Isaac looked at Riven. The dog didn't respond. Still standing, still silent, staring ahead as if seeing some distant forest no one else could. "You don't get Riven," Isaac said slowly. "I think we found each other at a time when neither of us had anything left to lose." The man was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Well, I hope I reach that time too," he murmured, not smiling. Isaac stepped forward, rested a steady hand on the man's shoulder. "That time isn't pretty," he said, "but it's real. And sometimes, that's the first thing we need." Outside, the late afternoon light had softened. A few golden leaves dropped from the trees. Not on any particular breeze, just drifting down like time itself, quiet and unhurried. Isaac stepped down from the porch. Riven walked beside him. No leash, no cue. They moved as if cut from the same shape. One who had relearned how to step into the light, and one who had never been taught, but always chose to stay each time the other trembled. And there, among a circle of people still mending, among stories no one wanted to relive, healing didn't come from words, or prescriptions, or carefully structured programs. It came from a gaze that waited, and a trust that knew how to stay still. They called it Open Circle Day, a gathering for veterans living with deep trauma, where speaking was welcome but silence was honored, and someone was always willing to sit beside you. That day, the circle had been opened wider, spilling out onto the back lawn beneath a temporary awning, chairs arranged in an arc rather than a closed ring, as if making space for what had not yet been spoken. Isaac sat near the edge, in his hand a steaming cup of peppermint tea. At his feet, Riven, no leash, no command, but not a step away. Sometimes, Isaac thought, if his words were like undercurrents trying to find shore, then Riven was the quiet sand beneath, never stopping the waves, but making sure they didn't swallow everything whole. One man began a story about the sound of roadside bombs in Kandahar. Another shared the moment he saw his own name stitched onto the helmet of a fallen comrade, because gear was passed between shifts. A young woman, her voice worn and cracked, didn't share a story. She just read 4 names, one at a time, then sat in silence. Riven didn't move. But his eyes, deep and still as a lake at dawn, held on to whoever was speaking. He didn't understand human language. But in that circle, everyone could feel it. There was someone truly listening. And that kind of listening never judged. Isaac's fingers tightened gently around the ceramic cup of tea. 3 sessions had passed, and he hadn't spoken a word. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he didn't know where to begin, or why he should begin at all. But today, as he looked down at Riven, still lying by his feet, eyes unwavering, something unlatched inside him, like a door that had never been locked, only waiting to be nudged open. "Fallujah," Isaac said, his voice graveled like stones shifting in a dry stream bed. "I lost my whole unit there." The room fell quiet. He didn't look up, didn't wait for anyone to respond. He just kept going, as if speaking to someone very close, but no longer here. "We had 1 day left, just 1 more day until extraction. And still—" He paused. His breath wavered. The tea in his hand tilted slightly, the rising steam brushing the inside of his wrist. "There was a last-minute call from the south. We changed route. No one had time to think, just follow orders. The vehicle exploded as we turned the corner." No one interrupted. No one asked for details. and no one tried to soften the truth with hollow condolences. Riven slowly sat up. He took a small step forward and rested his chin on Isaac's knee, not the desperate, trembling press of those early days, but something lighter, more certain, like a quiet signal. "I'm listening, and I'm here." Isaac's breathing steadied. "They said it was a miracle I survived. But what kind of miracle brings an explosion that still rings in your skull every night? What kind of miracle makes you wake at 2 a.m., certain you left someone behind?" His hand moved gently to the top of Riven's head. "It wasn't until this dog stayed still in front of me the night I almost smashed everything to pieces that I finally felt I wasn't alone anymore." Another silence passed. And then, from the far end of the circle, a man's voice rose. Low. Steady. "I understand. No explanation was needed. Because in that place, truth didn't have to be proven. It only had to be shared." After the session, Isaac didn't leave right away. He and Riven sat near the wooden fence behind the awning, where a few old rocking chairs creaked slightly in the afternoon breeze. The late sunlight streamed through the deep red maple leaves, catching in Riven's thick fur like a soft amber glow, like a slow-burning flame held gently in stillness. Isaac lowered his head and exhaled softly. "No one taught you how to sit through these circles, and no one taught me how to say all that." His hand brushed along Riven's back. Then, without warning, he let out a short laugh, not loud, not forced, more like a breeze passing after a long rain. "But today, we both did." Riven didn't answer, but in the dog's eyes, mirroring the golden light, there was something that responded without needing a single word. The next morning, Saturday, was clear like undisturbed water. Thin clouds drifted above the grassy hill behind the center, where today's session would be held outdoors, partly because of the perfect weather, partly because someone had said, "We need to remember that grass and wind can heal in their own way." Isaac arrived early. Riven walked beside him, even-paced, no leash needed. The grass was lush beneath their feet, scattered with dewdrops that hadn't yet disappeared. In the distance, a few wooden chairs were arranged in a loose circle across the open clearing. That spacious setting seemed carved out for the kind of memories that didn't yet have names, but needed somewhere to rest. Isaac didn't step into the circle right away. He followed a narrow stone path toward the slope's edge, where the earth caught the softest sunlight. Then he sat down. Riven settled to his right. No call needed. From his coat pocket, Isaac pulled out a small bundle, wrapped in dark, faded fabric with frayed seams. He unwrapped it slowly, like someone unfolding an old letter. It was a handkerchief. White, soft, but no longer pristine. In one corner, stitched in fine, faded brown thread, were the words, "Charlie, first to step, last to leave." Riven didn't look at it immediately. He just sat beside Isaac, as if sensing that this was something personal, something sacred. Isaac said nothing. His fingers brushed over the embroidery, stroke by stroke, stitch by stitch. Then he laid the cloth down gently on the grass in front of him. No photo, no flowers, no somber music. Just an old handkerchief. On green earth. In a morning where the sunlight wasn't too sharp, the breeze wasn't too cold, and no one was in a hurry. And then, without cue, without command, Riven leaned forward, slowly extended one front paw, and placed it on the handkerchief's corner, right over the stitched words. Not forcefully, not too softly, just firmly enough, like a nod given in the only language he knew. Respect. Isaac held his breath, not because he was overwhelmed, but because he understood. There was nothing more beautiful than a gesture born of pure feeling, not of obedience. Some members of the group began to arrive, No one interrupted. No one asked about the handkerchief. But every eye caught the light in Isaac's expression, not the kind worn by someone pretending to be strong, but the quiet glow of someone who had finally set down a heavy memory, gently and without a sound. An older man sitting nearby gently tapped Isaac's shoulder. He didn't ask anything. He simply said softly, "I once folded a letter and buried it under a stone. But maybe a handkerchief is enough." Isaac nodded. Riven kept his eyes fixed on the cloth. That day's group session had no designated leader. People took turns speaking. One person recounted a dream that had repeated for 10 years, where the only sound was the dragging of slippers down a military ward hallway. Another shared how they had finally started making breakfast again. And someone sat in silence, fingers grazing the grass, eyes focused on a point no one else could see. Isaac didn't say much. He only offered, "There are faces I can't remember clearly anymore, but when I see this cloth, I remember what it felt like to walk beside them." Then he glanced at Riven. "And this dog helps me believe some things aren't remembered with the mind. They're kept with the heart." No one spoke. It was the kind of silence that felt soft, like a breeze that doesn't disturb the cloth, but moves it just enough to make you wonder if someone, far away, had touched it. When the session ended, Isaac didn't rush to leave. He bent forward, carefully folded the handkerchief, and placed it back into his pocket. Riven stood, gave a light wag of his tail. There were no formalities, no farewells. Just a quiet morning in the open air, where an old piece of cloth was placed down, a look was exchanged, and a creature once terrified of everything had found the exact moment to speak, by saying nothing at all. That morning, the sky was clear, and the air held a soft autumn chill, just enough to make people keep their hands wrapped a little longer around their coffee cups. Isaac opened the mailbox like he always did. Catalogs, a few utility bills, and one white envelope with no logo, just his full name printed neatly in the top left corner. He picked it up, his fingers brushing the bold ink. In the early sunlight, the letters became clearer, plain, precise, without embellishment. It was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Isaac already knew what it was about, but didn't open it right away. The front door opened quietly. No creak. Riven stepped out, his paws landing gently on the wooden porch, each movement like a well-worn ritual. He paused, sitting beside Isaac, gaze resting on the envelope in Isaac's hand. Not eager, not curious, just present. Present enough for Isaac to know the moment mattered. He sat on the step. Wind slid across the porch rafters, nudging the wind chimes into a delicate whisper of sound. Isaac opened the letter. Inside was a certificate, RIVEN, German Shepherd, officially recognized as a member of the Animal-Assisted PTSD Support Unit. The final line read, "Endorsed by the Oregon State Veterans Mental Health Council. Date issued." Isaac folded it back up. He didn't smile, didn't seem surprised, didn't even look particularly emotional. He simply sat there, in a strange kind of peace, as if something important had just been acknowledged, and that was enough. Riven rested his chin on Isaac's knee, a gesture as gentle as the breeze, but enough to steady a man's soul. That afternoon, Isaac pinned the certificate onto the wooden bulletin board in the kitchen, next to a handwritten bread recipe from an old friend, and beneath a photo of his faded military ID card, worn from a decade of being carried. No frame, no spotlight, just a slip of paper among the scattered pieces of life. Now, finally, allowed to belong. He returned to the table, where Riven lay stretched out, belly against the warm wood floor. The dog looked up when Isaac sat down, then closed his eyes again, tail giving a soft thump. Isaac reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small treat. Not for training, not as a reward. Just a little gift because the sky was kind today, and because they had lived through so many days without names. Riven ate slowly, then settled back into stillness, expecting nothing, demanding nothing. Isaac looked at Riven, not as an owner, but as someone who had once survived by curling in silence at a window each morning, now looking at a creature who had stayed even when he almost walked away from the world. That night, when Isaac went to bed, he didn't lock the bedroom door, hadn't in a long time. But tonight, he left it slightly open. Riven lay where he always did, at the foot of the bed, head resting on a neatly folded blanket. In the dark, moonlight streamed through the window and traced a soft path across his back. Isaac turned onto his side, eyes resting on him. He didn't speak, but inside, a quiet question echoed. Could any certificate ever say as much as this gaze I see every morning already has? Because some things are not confirmed with stamps or signatures. They're made real by presence, by steady breaths under the porch light, by a single paw resting on a fallen name, by a creature who sat beside him since the trembling first day until now, when he was no longer the man curled by the window each dawn. Isaac exhaled. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure to whom. It could have been for Charlie, the one who fell during the final tour. It could have been for Riven, the one who never learned how to be a friend, but somehow understood how to stay in that role until the very end. Or maybe it was for himself, for finally choosing to stay. When Isaac closed his eyes, Riven remained there. Not to guard, not to comfort, just to be. And sometimes, in a mapless journey of healing, presence alone is the only thing strong enough to lift a soul out of an unnamed depth. Granite Bend Center opened its main hall for a special occasion, a gathering for veterans and volunteers who had walked alongside the center through many seasons. Tables were lined along the red brick hallway, mason jars held bundles of wildflowers, and a soft wooden guitar played from a corner of the courtyard, while children ran freely, as if this place had always been home to those who had once fallen and learned how to rise again. Isaac arrived in the afternoon, when the light had tilted fully toward the rows of old maple trees, casting a warm hue across the dark strands along Riven's shoulders. Riven walked beside him without a leash, without cues. Those who remembered them smiled, not in surprise, but with the recognition that something quietly steady still existed in a world where so much had changed. The sharing circle was set beneath the largest oak in the garden, with wooden chairs arranged in a loose ring. People took turns offering pieces of their story. Not in order, not needing to be whole, because what mattered wasn't the telling, but the way others chose to listen. When Isaac's turn came, every gaze turned to him. Not because he was extraordinary, but because Riven, the dog lying quietly by his feet, had become something of a symbol, not through title, but by simply being there through moments no one ever found words for. Isaac rose. His right hand gently rested on Riven's back, almost asking permission. He looked around. Faces old and young, some familiar from therapy circles, some new, but their eyes shared something. The look of those who had once known loss, but still held faith in something, however small. He spoke slowly, without notes, without anything but a voice steady and low. I used to want to leave, not just the town, everything. But Riven didn't leave me. No one told him to stay. He wasn't ordered. He just did. No one interrupted. No whispers. Just a pause. Silent and smooth, like the surface of a lake when the wind finally rests. And the night I sat on the porch, thinking the world wouldn't notice if I disappeared. He lay beside my feet, didn't nudge my hand, didn't lick my face, just stayed. And I thought, If there's a creature who chooses to stay with me at a time when I felt I had nothing left worth holding on to, then maybe, just maybe, I should try one more time. Isaac's voice didn't tremble, but no one in the circle could keep stillness in their eyes. Riven looked up. No bark, no movement. Just a gaze, as if knowing this exact moment was what the entire journey had been building toward. Isaac bent down, slipped his arm around Riven's neck, gave a soft pat on the shoulder. I'm not here because I'm healed. I'm here because someone once chose not to leave me. And I learned something. Not all wounds need to be fixed. Sometimes you just need someone to sit beside you while they still hurt. A few nodded. One or two quietly wiped their eyes. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting Riven's shadow long and clear across the grass, like a silhouette that would never leave the one it chose to walk with. As the gathering wrapped up, many came to shake Isaac's hand. A young man asked, "Do you think, if I didn't have a dog, I could still learn how to stay?" Isaac smiled. Maybe. But one thing's for sure. If you had a dog like Riven, you wouldn't have to learn it alone. Riven stood quietly beside him, tail swaying gently in agreement. An elderly woman stepped forward, bent down to stroke Riven's back, and whispered, "You don't need to say a word. You were the most beautiful part of every story today." That evening, as they left Granite Bend, the wind had grown slightly colder, signaling that the misty days were on their way again. But no one felt sadness. Because sometimes, just knowing that someone once chose not to leave is enough for the other to stay. One day, one breath, a little more each time. That afternoon, sunlight spilled across the weathered white fence in Isaac's backyard, slipped through the slats, and settled on the porch where two beings had spent season after season together. Nothing unusual had changed. Only the chill in the air was sharper, and the sunlight felt unusually warm, as if all that remained of autumn had gathered itself to gift a single perfect moment. Isaac wore a fraying gray sweater, a warm cup of tea in hand, saying nothing. Riven lay curled beside his feet, his head resting on Isaac's left foot, an instinct turned habit over months and seasons. There was no motion, no call, no need. And yet the presence between them felt more complete than any words ever written. From afar, the dirt path leading into the woods echoed with soft footsteps. A figure emerged through the pale mist of breath, just a young man, his hair cropped close at the nape, a faded military canvas bag slung over one shoulder, and eyes caught somewhere between alertness and something unnamed. He paused at the gate, hand hesitating as if torn between turning back or stepping forward. Isaac looked up, not nodding, not waving, just silent. Yet in that silence, his gaze, neither sharp nor questioning, was enough to steady the boy's hesitation and gently draw him in. He stepped closer, the dirt on his black shoes making the faintest taps against the wooden porch. Standing before Isaac, he finally spoke, his voice low, burdened, as though carrying something the entire length of the path behind him. "Can I sit here for a while?" No one answered at first. Only the breeze responded, brushing lightly against his hair, making the hem of Isaac's coat shift. Then, Riven lifted his head from Isaac's feet. Not slowly, not hurriedly, just enough for the meaning of the moment to settle clearly. He turned, stepped softly to the side, and gave up a space that seemed as if it had always been waiting for someone who had lost their way. Isaac didn't say, "Come in." He didn't pat the bench or gesture. The young man simply glanced at Riven, then bowed his head. Not quite a greeting, more like a breath of thanks, and sat down in the warmest space left by the afternoon sun. 3 figures now. One man who once tried to disappear, one German shepherd who had never been trained to save lives but stayed anyway, and one boy with no idea where the road ahead might lead, sat together under the slanted golden light on the porch, no one speaking. But somewhere inside that silence, something began to bloom, like the very first shaft of sunlight after a long, fog-drenched season. The teapot on the wooden table still let off heat. A thin curl of steam rose, drifted in the quiet air, and disappeared into the soft blue sky. Riven lay down again, this time not curled beside Isaac, but between the two of them, like a bridge, needing no nails to hold, yet perfectly connecting two distant shores of silence. No one needed to speak. There was no need to explain why they had come. No need to revisit the memories of nights jarred awake by echoes of explosions long gone. No one had to describe the weight of wishing to vanish when everything felt far too heavy. Because sometimes, all it takes is a place to sit, a look that doesn't turn you away, and warmth that asks no questions, for a person to feel they no longer have to be lost. The young man looked toward Isaac, maybe wanting to say something, but the words never came. Riven's tail thumped softly once against the wood, his eyes half closed, ears gently attuned to both sides, as if he knew the most important thing right now wasn't speaking, but simply being here. The afternoon drifted by slowly. A flock of sparrows cut across the sky, their soft shadows dotting the pale canvas above. Leaves fell into the yard, onto Isaac's shoulder, onto the boy's shoes, onto Riven's dark fur, and no one brushed them away. And in that quiet moment where nothing seemed to happen, something had already begun. From silence, from the warmth left on a porch step, from the first meeting of eyes between someone once held back from the edge, and someone trying to hold on for the first time. Not every wound needs stitching or bandages. Some pains live deep in memory, breathing quietly in each slow inhale, in every long, sleepless night. And sometimes, the world doesn't need another cure, just a quiet creature willing to sit beside you until the path home reveals itself. Riven's story, a German shepherd with no formal training, no decorated background, has shown us that healing doesn't always come through instruction. Sometimes it arrives through presence, through love not spoken aloud, through loyalty that doesn't need reminders. All it takes is staying with the one who needs you most, exactly when they believe they're no longer worth holding on to. German shepherds, renowned for their intelligence, loyalty, and protective instinct, are more than just partners in service. They are companions through the shadows, not with urgency, but with steps measured, steady, and unwavering. Through Isaac and Riven, we are reminded, every life has worth. Every soul, even the ones once abandoned, can become someone's light. And a little girl was trapped beneath a storm drain during the first flash flood of the season. No one heard her faint cries, no one but a stray German shepherd marked for destruction weeks before. And somehow, it was that very dog who let out 3 piercing howls, pulled her from the rising current, then vanished into the torrent without a trace. What happened afterward would forever change the way the town saw everything they thought they knew. What could make a dog return, risk everything, to save a child? The fluorescent lights hung like sterile halos above the steel table, their glow bleeding into the polished curves worn smooth by too many silent endings. Inside Crescent View Animal Clinic's back room, the air carried the sharp sting of antiseptics, bleach, and a kind of time that scratched against metal like something trying to be forgotten. The wind outside failed to move the thin curtain. It simply tapped, soft and rhythmic, against the wooden sill, like the sigh of a place more accustomed to farewells than reunions. Blitz, once cloaked in the deep chestnut of a burning forest, now lay curled up against the far wall of a metal crate, his coat matted with dried mud. His eyes were wide open, Not wild, not squinting in fear, but steady, calm, as if belonging to a creature that had already passed through the places where everything familiar had been lost. Blitz didn't bark, didn't scratch, didn't even stir. His head tilted slightly, as if still listening, for something he hadn't heard in a long, long time. On the medical tray nearby, Dr. Ellen Rhodes adjusted the glass syringe, the amber-colored liquid inside catching the low light like old honey. Every motion she made was precise, restrained, the practiced choreography of someone long used to doing things they never wanted to do. She didn't look at Blitz. Not yet. Her gloved hands kept moving through the sterile routine, but her mouth tightened. Not from cold, but from something trying to keep her from trembling. In the corner, Deputy Mark Halden held a stack of pale gray paperwork, his eyes flicking across the lines with a kind of reluctant focus. The stray animal termination request form had every box checked. Every box except the last. Next to the line that read, "Behavior, aggressive," someone had crossed it out in faint blue ink and written, almost apologetically, "Unconfirmed." "This is protocol," Halden said quietly, maybe to Ellen, maybe to himself. "Nobody wants to do this, but we're out of time." A sharp knock, wooden cane to metal door. Jonas Weller, a war veteran in his 70s, stood framed in the doorway like a weather-beaten statue, aged but unbroken. His hands trembled slightly with age, but his voice still carried the kind of weight that had once shouted orders through gunfire and smoke. "You're going to inject him, aren't you?" he asked, not accusing, not emotional, just certain. His gaze went straight through the small pane of glass toward where Blitz lay. Halden didn't answer. "I worked with 14 K9 units in the Army," Jonas said. "I know what fear looks like in a dog's eyes, and I know what conviction looks like too." Ellen's hands paused for just a moment, then resumed. "Mr. Weller," Halden spoke gently, "I respect everything you've done, but this dog, it was found next to an unconscious child, blood on its fur. Witnesses said it was standing over her. A child who's still alive. No tears in her skin, no bite marks. And a dog lying beside her." Jonas's eyes narrowed. "You really think that makes him a threat?" Halden was forced to look at Blitz, who still hadn't moved, still watching, still listening, still impossibly alert. There was nothing in those eyes that begged for mercy, nothing that flinched from judgment, just a quiet intensity, like a soldier trained to hear the difference between a falling leaf and the click of a landmine. A small ding cut through the air. The timer on the metal table lit up. 3 minutes. Ellen pulled her surgical mask up, slid on her glasses, and approached the crate. Her hand reached for the latch. Blitz raised his head. He didn't retreat, didn't resist. His eyes remained the same. Clear, unwavering, and strangely accepting, but not defeated. "Ellen," Jonas said her name softly. Not as a command, not a plea, just 2 syllables filled with everything he couldn't bring himself to say out loud. She froze, fingers touching the metal lock. For the first time, her eyes met Blitz's. And in that brief, fragile second, something beneath the clean white coat shifted. There, on the dog's shoulder, beneath a clump of dried mud, was a small patch of fur. Clean, soft, still brushed. This dog had once been cared for, towel-dried, trusted, loved. Someone, somewhere, had once walked beside him and believed in every step he took. Her gaze dropped to Blitz's left ear, where a small, almost invisible V-shaped notch had been clipped, the kind used by military units to mark trained K9s. "Maybe he didn't come from the street," she whispered. 2 minutes, Halden reminded. Out in the hallway, footsteps echoed. Just one pair. then silence. Through the small glass window, the faint red pulse of a nearby emergency light spilled into the room, catching Blitz's eyes with a soft gold shimmer. It was the color of something warmer than antiseptic, warmer than steel, warmer than the moment they all stood in now. And it hadn't come from the syringe. "We still have time." Jonas stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the dog, his voice edged with something raw and urgent. "Run the chip again. Call the K9 stations in other districts. Do something, anything, but don't reduce this to just a procedure." Ellen stood motionless, her hand still clutching the key but making no move to turn it, as if everything inside the room had been suspended between two heartbeats, held in a fragile pause that could break with the smallest sound. And then the sound came. A sharp, unexpected beep-beep from the electronic scanner in the corner of the room, piercing the silence like a spark in dry air, making all three of them turn at once. Halden frowned, tension rising in his voice. Is someone using the scanner right now?" No one answered. The device continued its rhythmic beeping, unbothered and unbroken. Blitz raised his head, ears pivoting ever so slightly, his gaze locked on the door, as if, in that instant, he had sensed something not meant to be here, something that belonged to another time, another world. And right then, the glass door outside hissed open automatically, and a figure stepped through, a silhouette shaped by rain, by uniform, by weight carried over distance and years. Dark gray fatigues, a soaked trench coat, a shoulder patch bearing the unmistakable insignia of the K9 unit, Halden County. The figure said nothing at first. They merely reached up and pulled back the drenched hood, revealing a face framed by wet hair and eyes hollowed by exhaustion, but holding within them a quiet intensity, the kind that halted time itself, as though even the air had stopped moving to witness what was about to unfold. Blitz stood, slowly, deliberately, for the first time that entire afternoon, and took a single step forward toward the heavy iron door now cracked open. No one spoke. Ellen still held the unused syringe. Halden tightened his grip on the folder in his arms. Jonas looked at Blitz, then at the figure in the doorway, with eyes that seemed to be seeing something he had once believed would never return to this world. A faint breeze drifted into the room, carrying with it the ghost of burnt tobacco from the shooting range, the scent of sweat absorbed into uniform fibers, the echo of boots on hardened concrete, and the unmistakable cadence of a voice once burned into memory, clipped and commanding, rising from a radio long silent. "K97, hold position, flank left, target release, go." Blitz did not growl. He did not bark. He did not tremble. He simply stood there on the cold floor, unmoving, surrounded by gray tiles that seemed to reflect back moments long buried in the recesses of memory. Memories that needed no narrator, for they had become embedded in every breath, every twitch of muscle, every inch of scarred skin. Time bent backward like spools of old footage being rewound, distorted, smeared, imperfect, yet vivid enough to bring Blitz back to a morning on the training grounds of Halden County PD K9 unit. Sunlight had slanted through rows of chain-link kennels, warming his back as he sat upright in the center of the yard, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on the whistle of command. In front of him stood Captain Elias Thorne, a man whose face never softened, not even in praise, and yet whose hands were always gentle when they rested upon Blitz's head. Back then, Blitz bore the call sign K97, etched with mathematical precision into his collar tag. No longer just a dog, but a piece of the system, a sworn part of the mission, the honor, the duty. Together, Blitz and Thorne had passed through many doors, the fogged rear doors of patrol trucks, the rusted gates of training stations, the wire fence leading into a high school field during drills, the cold steel doors of apartment buildings breached at midnight in hostage rescues. But there was one door Blitz could never forget: the rust-stained steel gate of an abandoned warehouse on 17th Street, the place where his name had been called for the last time amidst collapsing beams and choking dust. The narcotics raid order came at 3:48 p.m. Blitz and Thorne went in first, followed closely by 2 members of the Tactical Response Unit. The air was thick, laced with dry cement and a bitter trace of acid, slowing every step. Blitz picked up the shift in ambient sound in under a second: the high-pitched whine of metal under strain, the whistle of wind slipping through fractured rafters like someone breathing sharply through broken teeth. He turned, gave a short, guttural bark, and then launched his body into Thorne, his 38 kilograms of trained muscle slamming the man backwards, just as the ceiling gave way with a soundless detonation, and iron beams fell like guillotine blades. A chunk of concrete struck Blitz's hind leg. He didn't whimper. He didn't hesitate. He stretched forward, shielding Thorne's chest with his own. Then came smoke, then sirens, then the harsh light of an ambulance parked in the alley, and then a blanket thrown across Blitz's bloodied flank, the murmured voice of the squad leader crackling over comms. "K-97 is down." But he was still breathing. Blitz awoke in a white room, his leg bandaged, IV lines threaded into his neck. Thorne sat beside the bed, eyes red, holding a small slip of paper scrawled with crooked handwriting. "Transfer 97,000 Kenyan shillings to inactive status due to loss of physical capability." No one asked him what he wanted. No one waited for a signal from those eyes, still burning bright. 3 weeks later, Blitz was stripped of his tag. Thorne came, placed a hand on his neck, traced one last circle, then bent down and whispered, "I'm sorry, old friend." That day, a transport from Houston pulled up to the veterinary hospital. A man in a cropped coat opened the rear hatch, tapped the side of the van gently. Blitz climbed in without protest. There was no resistance, no wagging of the tail, just a slight limp in his step, a souvenir of duty, now labeled unfit for reconditioning. The van's final stop was at a dusty crossroads, surrounded by endless fields of nameless rice. The driver didn't leash him, didn't muzzle him, didn't call him back. He opened the door, let Blitz step down onto the ground, and spoke just one word: brief, flat, stripped of emotion, free of blame, free of promise. "Stay." The car door slammed. Dust spiraled up from the wheels as the vehicle rolled away, and Blitz stood right there, neither turning his head, nor running after it, nor howling into the distance. He stood for a full day, and then 2 nights more. No food, no rest, only listening, waiting for a familiar sound, a voice from the old radio, a siren wail, a footstep hesitating. Anything at all. And then, finally, the season's first rain fell on the worn road. Blitz left the intersection behind and began a new life, without a name, without a tag, without a handler, without a mission. Yet every time he paused under the shadow of a tree, every time a siren echoed through the town, or even when a stranger's eyes briefly caught his as though glimpsing something more than just a stray dog, Blitz would turn his head. Because somewhere inside that frame, K-97 was still reporting for duty. And this morning, a figure in a K-9 uniform stepped into the room, carrying something the months of wandering hadn't managed to erase. A breath of air laced with menthol smoke, a slender scar tracing the left wrist, a familiar furrow of the brow that used to appear only when that man called Blitz by name, in a voice firm, responsible, but never without care. Blitz inched forward. There was no command, no order, no whistle. But Blitz still stepped toward that silhouette. Jonas's grip tightened slightly around his cane. Halden looked up, lips parting as if to say something. Ellen let the syringe rest gently on the tray, her fingers hovering above the lid of the metal box. The ceiling light flickered once, its current weakened from last night's storm. And then the man in the K9 jacket finally spoke. Not loud, not rushed, but clear and deliberate, like he'd been waiting a long time to say it. "Rex," he called softly. "Partner. At ease." Blitz stopped. Just 1 second. Then lifted his head. His eyes lit up like a lantern catching spark in a damp night. And his tail moved, slow, steady, not frantic, not unsure, but with a rhythm that said every shift of muscle was reclaiming who he was. The wind slipped through a hallway crack, carrying the scent of damp earth and a faint trace of peanut butter toast left behind somewhere nearby. Soft, barely there, but unmistakable to a nose trained to find life under rubble, or to detect a foreign trace left only on a metal doorknob. Blitz's gaze turned, not as a reflex, but with deliberate clarity, following a path of impressions rising from memory, not buried but quietly waiting to surface at the scent of something lost and suddenly found. And then, at the far end of the hall, just behind the silhouette of the man who had knelt, was a small face, lips pressed into a firm line, wide eyes locked open. Mira Jennings. Maybe to a child, the days in Ravenshade had all blended the same. Mornings spent on the porch listening to birdsong, noon hiding from the sun beneath the maple tree, evenings floating leaf boats in shallow roadside water. But to Blitz, every hour carried unique patterns for survival. When sunlight tilted through the trees was the moment to withdraw. When distant engines roared was the time to slip deeper into the dark. And when silence dropped too suddenly was when all exits had to be reassessed. He had lived beneath the old timber eaves of Redwood Hollow for over 4 months, a place that once served as a tool shed, now held only the scent of damp wood and the chirping of crickets when night coated the ground. From there, Blitz observed the town, not with the eyes of a predator, but with the watchful precision of a canine trained to memorize human habits, detect shifts in routine, and analyze even the subtlest movements. He knew the man in black passed on a squeaky bicycle every morning at 6:15. He knew animal control only patrolled on even-numbered days, and never before 10 a.m. And he knew that in the east corner of the park, a little girl would sit folded into a bench, holding a small paper box, her gaze never tracking the crowd, but always drifting to the faint silhouette of Blitz, lingering behind the fence line. The first time Blitz encountered Mira was on a fog-wrapped morning, when the sun hadn't yet warmed the dew clinging to the grass. He had been moving toward the old irrigation basin beside the pipe shop, one of the few places left with clean water after the April drought. He made no sound, but when he turned, Mira stood no more than 5 steps away, holding a sandwich wrapped in pale pink napkin, the kind with tiny bear prints faded across its folds. She didn't speak, just held out her hand, but didn't move closer. Her face held no fear, only a quiet stillness, not waiting to approach, but waiting to be accepted. Blitz didn't go to her, he didn't lunge, he simply stood. 1 beat, 2, then stepped back, his eyes fixed. The next morning, Mira returned, placed the sandwich on a stone, and sat back a small distance. And did it again the morning after. After the 3rd time, Blitz understood. This wasn't bait, it wasn't a test, it wasn't part of any surveillance protocol. It was something else. Something beyond skill, reaching into a place in his memory no training had ever touched. That morning, before Blitz appeared at the clinic, the air was mild, the breeze strong enough to clear the market stench and muffle the chatter from Main Street. Blitz had left earlier than usual. He'd crossed under a rotting fence, skirted the flower shop's back lot, and paused at the edge of Redwood Hollow, where the old oaks stretched like open hands into the gray-blue sky. His hind leg still bore the strain of the collapse. The limp was faint. Weight shifted subtly to protect the damaged joint, but his steps remained measured, the rhythm precise, never dragging, never drawing attention. Under the broken rafters, he scratched at the dirt to remake his resting place. One swift perimeter check, reassessing wind channels, noting new scents, a female cat, spilled gasoline, a torn pair of adhesive-soled sneakers. All within control, until Blitz lifted his head and saw a small figure waiting at the edge of the light. Mira, no sandwich this time. Just a pale yellow sling bag and a small notebook pressed tight against her chest. Her face shone with perspiration, wisps of hair clinging to her cheek, and her eyes locked onto Blitz with the look of someone carrying a message too delicate for words. Blitz didn't move. Mira stepped closer. Very slowly. Each footfall measured like a ripple on still water. Then she stopped. Not too close, not too far. Just near enough for Blitz to catch the faint trace of soft soap absorbed into cotton fabric, and the almost imperceptible scent of sharpened pencil rising from the little notebook she held carefully in her hands. "I gave you a name," Mira said, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "I'm calling you Hero." The wind passed gently between them, carrying with it the faint, cheerful chirping of birds somewhere in the distant canopy. Blitz didn't react right away, but his ears twitched, turning toward the voice, like antennae tuning into something familiar, something he hadn't heard in a long time. "I know you're not a stray. You're smart. You watch things. I saw you wait for the crosswalk light. Twice." For the first time since he left the training compound, Blitz took a small step. Not toward her, but a tilt of the head, ever so slightly, in Mira's direction, as though recalibrating to the frequency of her voice, trying to understand what exactly was being said. Not through words, but through stillness, intent, and patience. Mira didn't rush. She didn't reach out with eager hands or excited squeals. She simply stood there, still, quiet, waiting in a way few ever had for him. Inside her sling bag, tucked gently beneath her hand, was a small plastic box, light in weight but held with careful firmness. And underneath that box, hidden from all eyes but known to her, was a crumpled piece of orange paper, smudged and wrinkled, bearing a message written in rough pencil lines. "If you see him again, ask, 'Do you remember you once saved someone?'" Blitz took another step, then paused, his gaze dropping briefly to the ground before lifting, meeting Mira's wide, open eyes. There was something in that moment, something not born of instinct, not shaped by memory, but hovering somewhere just above both. Something almost like recognition. Mira smiled, just a little. Not the gleeful grin of a child given candy, but the quiet smile of someone who realizes they've just found something that truly matters. In the distance, a siren wailed, broken at first, but repeating with the steady rhythm of 3 tones, familiar enough to make Blitz shift slightly, his body angling toward the sound out of pure reflex. Down the road, a rescue vehicle crawled along the town's main street. Mira turned her head to look. "Something's happened in town," she whispered. Blitz followed her gaze. The vehicle wasn't orange, like the medical ones. It was gray-white, and emblazoned faintly on its roof, catching the low eastern light, was a wolf emblem, the mark of the K9 unit. The next morning, Mira rose earlier than usual, so early that her mother hadn't yet returned from her night shift at the health center, and the third-floor apartment was still blanketed in a hush so complete she could hear the ticking of the wall clock threading through the morning air. She pulled on a silver-gray hoodie, tucked her hair under the hood, and began placing slices of bread into a plastic container, each coated with a precise layer of peanut butter, spread just thick enough not to stick to the roof of the mouth, and just thin enough not to be swept dry by the breeze. When wrapping the sandwiches in napkins, she chose one printed with brown bears, hugging red hearts, the exact same kind she had used the first time she brought food to Blitz. No one had told her to do it. No one had taught her how to speak to a dog that had never wagged his tail at strangers, never pressed his nose into an open palm, never so much as growled in response to the hundreds of calls made through whistles or voice commands. It was just that, from the very first time she saw Blitz in the shadow of that tree, Mira had known. He was different. The empty field behind the old gas station, where a concrete drainage pipe lay half exposed and half covered in dry grass and creeping vines, was far from the prettiest place to have breakfast. But it was where she came every morning, because that was where Blitz sometimes passed through. Not at the same time, not from the same direction, but always at the same distance, as if it were planned. She laid the napkin on the cool earth, set the food container on top, then backed away, settling herself quietly on a flat stone nearby. Her hands were clasped in her lap. Her eyes, steady and watchful, fixed on the vague, shifting silhouettes moving through the low brush in the distance. After a while, Blitz emerged. There was no sound, only the slow unfolding of form from shadow, paws placed with surgical precision, shoulders rolling forward with every measured step, as if each movement was still governed by muscle memory, by training that had soaked into his very blood. Mira did not call to him, and Blitz did not approach hastily. He stopped roughly 3 steps from the food, his head lowered, nostrils flared. Then Blitz advanced by 1 more step, still silent, avoiding even the crunch of dry leaves, as the sunlight crept slowly down across his back, catching threads of fur, brown mixed with gray, like a layer of ash clinging to memory. He lowered his head. But before he ate, he sniffed. For a long time, his breath barely disturbed the ground beneath him. Then he stepped back, just half a pace, and waited. Only then did he lean forward again, tongue carefully tasting the edge of 1 slice. Just a little. Then he looked up, eyes scanning the grassy edge. And only then did he begin to eat, slowly, methodically, checking between bites as if something hidden might be tucked inside. A microchip, a tracker, a test. Mira let out the tiniest smile. "You're not a stray," she whispered, not for Blitz to hear, but to place the truth into the air. "You're more like a cop." Blitz finished half the sandwich, then stepped back, not leaving, but simply shifting to the side. His eyes turned toward the distant town below, where the morning sirens had cried out not long ago. Mira pulled a small notebook from her jacket pocket, flipped to the page folded at the corner, a pencil sketch of a dog standing next to a fire hydrant, wearing a police hat, and a messy line beneath it that read, "If I were a cop, I'd catch bad guys without hurting anyone." She looked at Blitz for a long time. "You know," Mira said slowly, "the day I fell into the ditch, no one heard me. No one. Except you." Blitz did not move. "I don't remember how you got me out," she continued. "Just remember a shadow standing over the water, the smell of wet fur, and a scent, just like Dad's old coat." After breakfast, Mira stood, brushed the dirt from her hem, then pulled out 1 last napkin and scribbled a quick note in blue pen. "I'll be back tomorrow afternoon. Same time." She folded it and slipped it into a crack in the rocks near the spot Blitz usually rested. She didn't know if Blitz could read, but he always seemed to know when the food had come, who had left it, and from which direction. That afternoon, when Mira returned once more, she didn't bring food. She brought a small pouch, inside of which was a first aid kit, gauze, saline solution, and a clear plastic bag of cotton. She stood several steps away from Blitz, didn't try to get closer, but lowered the pouch to the ground and opened the lid. "Your leg still leans to one side. Must hurt." "I know how to clean wounds. My mom taught me." Blitz turned his head. His eyes did not blink, and though his ears twitched slightly, there was no trace of hesitation in his stance. Mira didn't touch Blitz. She simply took out the gauze, unscrewed the saline cap, and laid everything neatly on a clean napkin beside her. She sat and waited. No commands, no coaxing. And after a quiet pause, Blitz walked toward her, not quickly, not cautiously, but in the steady, intentional way of someone choosing their destination rather than reacting to it. Mira cleaned his leg, just a minor swelling around the back joint. Blitz didn't snap, didn't growl. He only kept his eyes fixed on her hands. And when the girl finally placed her palm against the damp, cool fur, his eyes gently closed, as though something old and buried stirred inside him. A memory of sunlight on gravel, a firm command to sit, and the dusty palm of Captain Thorne. As dusk fell, Mira packed up her kit, closed the lid of the tin, and remained a little longer, her back resting against a broken lamppost. "I think someone's looking for you," she said softly. "Maybe someone kind. Maybe even a police officer. But what if they don't recognize you anymore?" Blitz gave no answer, because there was no need. He only turned toward the edge of the stone slab, lifting one paw to rest on its corner, and looked out across the town, where golden streetlights had just blinked on, casting a faint path beneath the dark canopy of trees. Mira followed his gaze, her chest tightening in that fleeting moment. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a creased flyer, printed with the image of a tall man and the caption beneath, "Missing, Elias Thorne. Canine Unit Captain, Holden County PD. Contact if seen." She looked at Blitz, folded the flyer back, said nothing more, just tucked it into her pocket. Then rose to her feet. Her hand lingered in the fabric, as if what she had just put away carried something weightier than paper and ink. The wind shifted. Mira made her way down the narrow path beside the drainage ditch, where the stones were rounded smooth by countless steps, where thin moss edged along cracked bricks, where she had once hidden the first plastic box Blitz had ever touched with his mouth. There was a heaviness to the air that hadn't been there earlier. The sun was still visible, but the warmth had faded. Clouds drifted lower, wrapping the rooftops in a mist that looked like breath rising from a lake stirred by invisible hands. Mira didn't seem to notice, or maybe she had grown used to the sudden moods of the hillside weather near the lake. She only knew this morning deserved one small act of play before it ended. She sat by the edge of the stone-lined bank, pulled from her pocket a large maple leaf, folded it gently in half, creasing the stem into a point, and placed it lightly into the shallow stream. The leaf floated. Softly. So slowly. Skimming across water so shallow it was almost a mirror stretched thin between two dirt banks, but enough to carry the leaf forward on its delicate, meandering course like a tiny boat. Mira smiled. She added another, this time an oak leaf. Smaller, browner, but still buoyant. They floated side by side, one behind the other, then split at a fork near the drain, like two friends sharing the same game, but heading down different paths. Blitz stood beneath the shade of a tree farther back. He never took his eyes off her, but he didn't move forward. Just stood there, still and silent, like a punctuation mark on a page still being written. "My dad used to do this with me," Mira murmured, not quite to Blitz, not quite to herself. He'd fold leaves, place them on the water, and say each one was a journey. A journey you couldn't go back on, only follow wherever it led. She was quiet again. Then leaned over and placed a third leaf into the stream, this one a eucalyptus, long, slightly curled at the edges, like a hurried message torn from an old notebook. Dad died when I was 5. They said it was an accident, but Mom never gave the details. Just said he wasn't coming home anymore. Blitz tilted his head slightly. The wind picked up. The first raindrops touched the surface. Not in sheets, not yet. Just a few delicate taps popping against the water's skin like scattered punctuation in an unfinished melody. Mira looked up. The clouds were no longer white. They'd turned thick gray, then darker still. And as the light from the south flickered out, the silence deepened until she could hear the leaves brushing against each other like frightened hands searching for one another in the dark. I have to go, Mira said, her voice beginning to blur into the wind. I'll come back soon. She lifted her bag, ran back up the slope, past the flattened grass already swaying under the rising gusts. And just before disappearing over the ridge, she looked back toward Blitz. By then, Blitz had already stepped toward the edge of the drain, where the third leaf, her eucalyptus message, was now caught in a gentle whirlpool, spinning slowly, silently, beneath the falling rain. Blitz backed away toward the old repair shop, where the moss-covered awning had shielded him from 3 animal control sweeps and 2 major storms back in January. He lay down, his head resting against the cool concrete floor, eyes fixed toward the main road, where doors had begun to slam shut, where pedestrians had vanished inside, and where car horns rang out in pulses like the beating heart of the town. Then a new sound broke through. Not rain, not footsteps, not tires on gravel. It was long, measured, rhythmic, its tone steady, unwavering. The town's emergency alert system. A voice followed, crackling through the speakers mounted on the central square's lamppost. Faintly distorted, but still clear enough for Blitz to make out every word. Level 1 alert. Flash flooding possible in low-lying areas. Residents in basements are advised to evacuate immediately. Avoid culverts, storm drains, and underground roads. Blitz didn't move, but his back tensed. One beat, then eased. As if a command had just been given, not in language, but in the quiet pulse that ran from the base of his neck, through his shoulders, down into his legs. Water began to rush in. The pounding of the rain against the corrugated metal roof merged with the furious gushing from the nearby drainage pipe. A ceaseless rush of water carrying with it rotting leaves, bits of garbage, and crumpled scraps of paper, some of which drifted slowly toward the canal where Mira had just been sitting moments ago. Blitz rose to his feet. Not because he wanted to leave, not because something forced him to move, but because something had shifted, something imperceptible yet undeniable. And he knew, deep in the marrow of his trained bones, that waiting was no longer an option. He lifted his paws, stepped beyond the shelter of the awning, where the water struck up from the street like dozens of tiny slaps against his pads, sharp, cold, insistent. But he didn't retreat. Instead, he crossed the lot, rounded toward the edge of the open field, heading in the direction where Mira's small frame had vanished behind the thicket of trees. The rain had thickened, no longer falling in a rhythmic patter, but descending in heavy sheets, as though the sky itself had been forced downward by an invisible weight. Wind screamed through the town with the frantic cadence of lungs gasping for breath. Windows slammed, electrical lines swayed, and wooden signboards creaked and groaned as if whispering desperate warnings from another realm. Blitz tore through the low brush, his once injured legs now thrusting forward with every ounce of remaining strength that years of buried instinct had preserved like a dormant ember waiting to ignite. His paws were soaked, his pads worn, but he ran as if this were the final assessment, the last mission to prove he was still part of the code, the creed, the cause. The gate leading to the drainage system stood slightly ajar, pushed open earlier by someone, or perhaps nudged by the very wind that had summoned this moment. Blitz didn't hesitate. He slid down the slick cement ramp, claws scraping faintly against the moss-covered surface, before he dropped straight into the dark below, where the only illumination came from the faint, diffused light at the tunnel's mouth and the echoing crash of water beating against the soaked brick walls. "Someone... help!" The voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Blitz halt in place, right there in the damp corridor. His head swung left, ears perked and stiff. No orders, no command, only instinct awakened, something primal and sacred uncoiling from the deepest part of his consciousness like a flare in the dark. "Help me. I can't breathe." The voice was thin, like a breath pushed through water, fragmented by panic and rising fluid, torn into gasps that barely reached the thinning air. Blitz leapt across a flooded patch, then stopped at the edge of a wide opening, where the main drain sloped into a steep iron staircase that plunged downward and caught between the rusted rungs, tangled awkwardly, was a small figure. Mira. Her gray hoodie was plastered to her body, her hair soaked and clinging to her cheeks in clumps, her eyes barely open, her left hand clutching the railing, while the right reached outward blindly, like a severed flower stem still turning toward the light. Blitz didn't bark. He paused, only for a second, but in that second, his gaze moved quickly, calculating position, flow, pressure, danger, the angle of descent and distance to reach, just like every time before, whenever he was dropped into reconnaissance or a hostage recovery op. Then, lifting his head high, neck stretched to the ceiling, Blitz let out a powerful, resonant howl. 3 precise notes, perfectly spaced, unwavering and exact down to the millisecond. Not a cry for help. A canine emergency signal. 3 short howls, each rising in pitch, each sliced with sharp intent, familiar enough that anyone who had once heard them would stop mid-stride and turn. The call ricocheted through the underground, traveled up towards the Earth's surface, slipping through cracks in the storm drain, riding the rising water, carried by the wind now roaring through the trees above. But no voice replied. No siren, no hurried footsteps, no sweeping flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Only the roar of the flood, climbing higher, as if determined to swallow the corridor whole, and the girl within it. Blitz looked up one last time, his eyes glistening, with water or something else. No one could say. Then he lunged forward, leaping down the staircase rung by rung, his paws sliding over slick iron, water splashing outward with every landing, body hurling itself toward the only thing that mattered now. Mira opened her eyes slowly, like a door rusted shut for years. Her breath was faint, her gaze unfocused, drifting until it settled on the dim shape of Blitz through the flood-darkened haze. "You," she whispered. It wasn't even a word, more like a wisp of fog through pale lips, but her mouth curled into a tiny smile, the kind that only appears when someone has given over to complete and absolute trust. Blitz crouched beside her, inspecting the leg pinned between 2 rungs, her knee swollen, blood soaking through the fabric of her pants, the water already up to her waist. He licked her hand gently, then turned and pressed his back against her body, making space, offering contact, becoming something solid for her to lean against. The current grew stronger. Leaves, silt, Even small branches began to spin in the narrowing flow. A broken length of pipe slammed against the stairbase. Mira flinched, her hand tightening around Blitz's neck. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't move except to brace. Hind legs dug into the bottom step, front paws hooked against the brick ledge of the wall, forming a living brace, anchoring Mira's body above the rising flood. Her head now rested fully against his shoulder, her torso tilted just high enough to keep her mouth out of the water. Blitz breathed in rhythm, slow and mechanical, like a metronome wound by the memory of that last warehouse collapse, when his chest had borne the weight of his handler, his captain, through the smoke. In the midst of the thunder of the water, Blitz howled again, this time lower, softer, like a voice from the earth itself, a signal not for rescue, but for acknowledgement, that here, in this place, a life was still waiting. Above, not far from the drain, an old man had just opened a second-floor window, tea in hand. He froze, eyes narrowing, head tilting toward the sound that had risen through the storm from beneath his feet. Below ground, Blitz remained immovable, shielding Mira with his body, unmoved even as the current struck harder with every second. Every time the water slammed into his spine, he braced tighter, muscle locked, forming a bridge of flesh and bone to hold the girl against the coming surge. His eyes remained wide, fixed across the corridor to where a faint shimmer of light was breaking through from the auxiliary pipe. It wasn't an exit, it was merely a reminder that this space still belonged to the world above. Blitz did not look at it as a destination. He looked at it as a perimeter, like the ones marked on recon maps during operations. A line to hold. Hold, at any cost. Mira's breathing had weakened. She no longer winced when the water lapped against her face, no longer shivered when metal clanged against metal. Her small hands now simply clung to the cloth of Blitz's chest, fingers slack and trembling. Her head had tilted, her cheek pale and pressed against the wall, gently tapping like a leaf caught in the flow. A thin trail of blood now ran from beneath her pant leg, swirling faintly into the water. No one knew exactly when it started, but now it was enough to stain the fabric dark red. Blitz lowered his head, nudged gently at the wound with his nose, then pulled back slightly, as if scanning for severity, weighing options, measuring time left. The water was at their chests now, and each blow from the current no longer nudged. It threatened to rip away, inch by inch, all that remained upright. Blitz shifted his stance again, lowering to a rung beneath, redistributing his weight fully into Mira's side, holding her steady, holding her still, holding her here. Blitz turned his body sideways, stretching his neck forward just enough for his muzzle to catch the edge of her hoodie collar. His teeth closed gently on the fabric. No sudden tug, no desperate pull. He held that position through 3 long, deliberate breaths, then shifted, bracing his shoulders, tightened his grip, and began to inch backward up the concrete steps above. Mira rose slightly. A loose metal pipe tore from the wall and crashed into the current behind him. The echo roared like distant gunfire, a line in time drawn between hesitation and action. Blitz didn't turn around. He pulled again, Mira climbing another step, not by effort, but by the sheer will in Blitz's grip. Rain had soaked into her hoodie, mud mixing into the folds, blood threading through the fabric until the weight pressed down like wet stone against every movement. But Blitz never once pulled back. 20 minutes passed. Time counted not by clocks, but by water slapping against steel, by the echo of wind ricocheting off concrete, by the subtle shift in stance as Blitz changed legs to redistribute force. Mira had fallen unconscious after striking her head against the edge of a step. Her body slumped, face turned to the side, lips pale, chest barely rising. She hung there like a waterlogged coat, limp and cold, and it was enough to make Blitz pause, eyes fixed forward, unblinking, as though waiting for one last signal of life. Then Blitz lifted his head. The howl wasn't loud, but it carried. 3 precise calls, drawn out longer than usual, the official K.9 emergency cadence, reverberating through concrete and rain, pushing up from the tunnels and reaching the surface of Crescent Lane, where stormwater now swallowed nearly every other sound. A man closing up his shoe repair shop at the street's end suddenly turned his head, key still half in the lock. A young mother at the intersection paused, her child clutched to her chest, gaze drawn toward the faint end of a concrete trench running parallel to the curb. At the town's emergency monitoring station, a secondary antenna activated. At that very moment, the frequency recorders picked up a low-band distress signal, flagged and logged. Possible canine signal. Canine, distress, Crescent sector. Blitz knew none of this. All he knew was that no one had answered yet. And with every second that passed, more of Mira's life was slipping through the hold he'd barely kept. So he pulled again. Mira's left arm struck a stair edge, a dry thud, sharp as bone against rusted metal. Blitz exhaled heavily, adjusted his footing, then pivoted, sliding his shoulder beneath her torso, lifting and stepping back up with everything he had left. The water had now reached his jawline, every breath a fight through icy swirls slapping against his nose. Still, Blitz didn't stop. He growled, a short, guttural burst, not a threat, but the call of a soldier summoning his final surge. Then, somewhere above, a clank, metal against metal, the distinct sound of a latch being released. Blitz raised his head, ears snapping forward. Light. Not the filtered light from a side tunnel, but from the opposite direction, where a narrow passage had just been pried open by hand. Flashlight beams slicing down through the runoff, landing right at the edge of the storm channel. A voice echoed, half lost in water, but clear enough to reach Blitz. "Is anyone down there?" Blitz barked once, sharp and definite, then turned to Mira, pressed his muzzle to her cheek in one final confirmation, as if to say, "They heard us." Then his teeth locked onto her collar again, ready to pull her that final step. 4 blocks away, on the moss-covered rooftop of an old wooden house at the forest's edge, a man stood by the window, not waiting for the rain to pass, not expecting anyone to come home. He stood because of the sound, that unmistakable howl, 3 notes spaced in rhythm, climbing in pitch with the biological urgency of those who had once survived war not by luck, but by bond. Jonas Weller, veteran of 3 deployments, 4 border zones, and a final mission that ended without ceremony, without flag or drum. Only a K9 with a fading tag on its right ear. His hand tightened around the handle of a cane that had waited beside the cabinet for weeks. Then he turned, opened a drawer, retrieved a rusted flashlight tucked beside an old cassette radio, and flicked it 3 times to check that the beam could still punch through this storm. He didn't put on a raincoat. He didn't call for help. He descended the stairs, each wooden step groaning with the familiarity of years, opened the door, and walked into the storm. Just minutes after Blitz's 3rd howl, the tunnel mouth lit up under the sharp white glare of the Rescue Unit 47's floodlights, radio static blending into the rush of water, rubber boots thudding down into the channel as responders advanced in a cadence that felt like the beat of something quietly shifting back into place. Mira lay cradled in Jonas's arms, her body almost disappearing inside the frame of those worn but steady limbs, her face streaked with rain-diluted mud, hair clinging to her cheek and throat like thin ribbons of moss. But Jonas's hands didn't shake. Not from cold, not from fear. Because moments like this demanded stillness more than prayer. Because sometimes one lingering breath is enough to keep the world intact. A young medic rushed in, dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to Mira's chest, then looked up with a choked exhale. She has a pulse. Weak. But it's there. The woman beside him fumbled the straps, dragged the stretcher to the road's edge, and in seconds Mira was lifted, her body wrapped in a silver thermal sheet that glimmered like fish scales in the rain-drenched light. Through it all, Blitz stood at the edge of the culvert. Legs caked in mud, fur soaked to the bone, a crimson streak trailing down from his nose to his jaw. Mud or blood, no one could say. He didn't move forward, didn't back away, just stood there, head lowered, ears drawn flat in the posture of defensive alert. But his eyes never left Mira, as if still awaiting an order from the commander he once knew. Then a shrill voice pierced the fragile air, snapping it like a taut wire. "That dog! There's blood on its mouth! I saw it! It attacked her!" Edna Vale, the town's chronic complainant, neighbor to anyone she didn't like, pointed directly at Blitz, face flushed, lips trembling, her voice rising more from fear than fury. The group around Mira stilled. A few EMTs turned. 2 arriving officers stepped forward, hands brushing the radios on their vests. Jonas turned his head toward Edna, and the look in his eyes carried neither anger nor softness, but rather the wearied gaze of someone who had stood too long at the blurry edges of right and wrong, where words could wound deeper and swifter than any bullet, where judgment was a blade, and truth was often a shadow cast by fear. "You said blood?" he asked, his voice low and heavy, like wood grinding slowly against stone. "On its muzzle. I saw it. It was just standing there, staring at the girl. It might have... Her words faltered the moment Blitz stepped forward toward the mouth of the drain. Not quickly, not with force, but with a deliberate calmness, like he was returning to finish a task he had never truly walked away from. He passed to Jonas's right, crossed the cement path without pause, approached the edge of the storm corridor where the water still churned wildly, and then, without ceremony, leapt in again, vanishing into shadow. The group stood in stunned silence. "What the... It went back in?" Jonas shook his head slowly, not in disapproval, but as though even he hadn't seen that coming. Not entirely. But less than 30 seconds later, a bark echoed upward from the darkness, clipped, precise, split into 2 even bursts. And Blitz emerged once more, this time dragging behind him a lemon-yellow child's raincoat snagged at the edge of the tunnel, soaked through and heavy with mud, and cradled within it was a doll, waterlogged and stained, arms still curled protectively around a torn slip of notebook paper. Blitz released the bundle at Jonas's feet, then raised his head, locking eyes with him. For a few suspended seconds, no one said anything. Then one of the 2 officers stepped forward, knelt, carefully peeled the fabric apart, and handed the dripping doll to the medical technician. A woman's voice broke through the silence. "That's Mira's! She brings that doll every time she comes to the clinic. I know it!" Jonas knelt and rested a hand on Blitz's head. "Good work," he whispered, the words nearly lost in the air. But when he rose, the officers were no longer watching Blitz with suspicion. They were observing him with something else entirely. Consideration. One crouched, inspecting Blitz's muzzle carefully, running a thumb across the fur. "No bite marks. The red smear? Could be from Mira. Maybe when he pulled her up by the jacket." But Edna wasn't finished. Not yet. "And that howl? That was a hunting dog's cry. I've heard it before. You can't trust animals like this." Jonas looked at Blitz. Blitz looked back, and Jonas turned to the officers, Not with pleading, not with a smile, but with the solid, measured weight of a man laying out fact. That was a canine emergency signal. 3 pulses, a coded alert that a human life is in immediate danger. No one replied. Only the wail of the approaching ambulance filled the space, the sound rolling over rooftops, slamming off corrugated sheets and metal awnings, an undeniable confirmation that what had just happened had not come from instinct alone, but from training, from memory, from a loyalty that had never left even when everything else had. A medic rushed from the vehicle, paper in hand, eyes urgent. The girl's stable, mild hypothermia and asphyxia, no internal trauma. If she hadn't been found within the next 15 minutes, she wouldn't have made it. Everyone turned toward Blitz. He stood quietly, his gaze fixed on Mira atop the stretcher, as if watching to confirm that the one he'd chosen to protect was now beyond reach of harm. At Ravenshade Regional Hospital, the overhead lights cast long, sterile beams across corridors that stretched endlessly into pale silence, each step echoed by the sharp click of a doctor's heel, each heartbeat measured out in beeps, each door swinging gently as though anticipating something still unknown. Claire Jennings rushed the nurse's desk the moment she heard the news from rescue dispatch. Her hair drenched, jacket streaked with dirt, hands clenched as though still frozen in the grip of panic from the second she received the call. "Your daughter's been found, in the storm drain." "Room 12, 3rd floor," the nurse answered quickly. Claire didn't wait. She ran, down the corridor, into the elevator, out like a woman dragged forward by wind rather than feet, until she stood before a white door bearing Mira's name in childish purple marker. Inside, Mira lay turned gently to one side, her eyes closed, her small hand resting near the pillow, blanket drawn to her chest. Claire approached, sat at the bedside, took her daughter's delicate hand into hers, and stared, unblinking, at that pale face still faintly warmed by breath. A nurse stepped close and placed a hand softly on Claire's shoulder. "She woke up a few minutes ago. It looked like she was calling for someone." Claire leaned in, close enough to catch even the faintest exhale. Mira's lips moved. "He's Hero." A tear dropped onto Claire's hand. No one could say if it had come from Mira's warming skin or from Claire's overwhelmed eyes. The story spread like wind through shattered windows. Girl rescued from floodwaters in Crescent Lane by stray dog. Police investigating dog with blood on muzzle. Heroic act or hidden danger. Everyone in town heard fragments, through text alerts, morning radio, or whispered conversation over bitter coffee. Outside the hospital room, Claire stood silently with a warm paper cup, her eyes locked on the hallway's wall-mounted television, where a short news segment played again and again. The image of Blitz, chest deep in floodwater, his eyes catching the beam of a flashlight like mirrored glass, reflecting truths too deep for words. That dog's brave, no doubt, but we still don't know where he came from. What if next time he bites someone? You don't just howl in 3 pulses unless you're canine trained. Then why is he wandering like a stray? At the old diner near the square, table 4, usually reserved for newspapers and quiet nods, became the center of debate. One side argued Blitz was a sign of something still good, something unsurrendered, like the town's soul breathing through a hidden artery. The other warned of caution, of instinct over reason, of how emotions blur the line between safe and dangerous. Edna Vale, who had cried out at the scene, sat a few booths down, lips pressed tight, eyes glued to her phone screen where a blurry photo of Blitz, muzzle-stained, circulated beneath a bold red headline. Dangerous or Defender. At the town's animal control shelter, Blitz was being held in a private room. Glass wall, padded flooring, no collar, no chains, only soft light and silence. He lay there, not sleeping, not pacing, just watching the door from time to time, as though listening for a sound he hadn't yet heard. The slow, solid steps of Jonas, or Mira's quiet laugh echoing back through a memory he refused to let go. An attendant entered, placed a dish of food gently on the floor. Blitz didn't approach. He tilted his head slightly, assessing. Then returned, silently, to his place by the wall. Because instinct, once forged in duty, did not allow for lowered guard, inside the internal meeting room of the Halden County Police Department, Deputy Chief Halden stood silently, eyes moving over a report stamped with urgent red ink. In front of him lay an old case file photograph. A German Shepherd, lean and alert, bearing the unit number K97, once part of the Halden County K9 Division, officially marked as lost in transfer after a miscommunication during reassignment. Halden's grip on the edge of the folder tightened slightly. He looked up, his gaze shifting towards the precinct wall map, where the spot Mira had been found was circled in red ink. "The same location as the drug raid 4 years ago," he muttered, nodding faintly as a line connected the past to the present in the quiet space between thoughts. That evening, in a softly lit hospital room, Mira sat upright for the first time since regaining consciousness. Claire was pouring water into a cup when she heard her daughter's voice behind her. "Mom, will he come back?" "Who, sweetheart?" "Blitz. I called him, and he came. He held me up in the water." Claire sat beside her on the bed, pulling Mira gently into her arms, her fingers pressing lightly against the girl's back as the rhythmic sound of her breathing settled into a calm, even cadence, like the quiet, steady heartbeat of a peaceful afternoon. "You know his name?" Claire asked. Mira nodded. "Did he tell you, or did you make it up?" "I don't know. But when I closed my eyes, I saw a tag on his neck. The letters were faded, but I could read the word Blitz." Claire didn't say anything. Her hand moved slowly through her daughter's hair, and for a brief, nearly imperceptible moment, something shifted within her, something that bypassed logic, slipped past fear, and wrapped around a fragile, childlike trust that maybe, just maybe, faith could still flow backward through everything broken, and begin to rebuild itself from the tiny, glowing fractures in a whispered voice that believed goodness could survive even in the deepest, darkest drains. In the record archive room of Halden County PD, dim amber light fell upon a wall lined with filing drawers worn smooth by time. Sienna Vale, her hair tied high, her eyes sharp like ink lines across an evidence log, sat beside Jonas Weller, the war-hardened veteran whose words always hovered at the lowest register, like each sentence had once been tested in fire before being spoken aloud. "The girl said the name was Blitz?" Sienna asked, eyes still on the computer monitor. Jonas nodded. "Looked like a worn neck tag. Mira could read part of it. I think we should try running a search in reverse." Sienna began filtering through the statewide K9 chip registry. She narrowed parameters by coat color, last known region, and handling unit, then stepped back to let the system scan. A soft ping. One entry surfaced, K9-K97, call sign, Blitz, unit, Halden County PD, transfer failure, March 14th, 2021, status, lost in transit en route to retirement facility, Tennessee. No one spoke. Jonas leaned in closer, eyes settling on the last line. Last recorded activity. Warehouse collapse rescue. Southern town perimeter. One survivor. Captain Elias Thorne. Sienna leaned back, fingers brushing her earpiece, and exhaled like someone seeing a name they'd long assumed gone suddenly resurface, like a letter from the past arriving without a return address. "Not a stray," she said, voice quiet, steady. "A veteran." The words didn't just verify a file once misplaced in an overburdened system. They opened the door to a chapter Jonas had tried hard not to revisit. A chapter about dogs pulled from service not because they had failed, but because the system needed clean numbers, tidy budgets, and clear lines for future planning. Even if it meant leaving behind partners who still stood guard silently, eyes never once turning away from duty. Sienna printed the confirmation, slid the page into a thin brown folder, and pulled out her phone, scrolling through her marked contacts until she found one labeled a 17, retired K9 facility, Tennessee. She dialed. After several rings, a voice picked up, low, raspy, but kind. K9 Reception Center, this is Cole. Hi, Officer Vale, Ravenshade, PD. I'm looking into a K9 identified as Blitz, Registry K97. File shows he was reported missing during transport to your facility 2 years ago. Can you check that for me? There was a 5-second pause, then the sound of papers being shifted. Cole's voice dropped slightly. Yeah, we've got that name. But that shipment reported rear door opened during minor collision. 1 K9 jumped at a rural exit, never recovered. We filed a notice, but it probably got pushed into a non-priority queue. Sienna frowned. Do you have the exact location where Blitz was last seen? Western Halden perimeter, near Old Creek Junction. Pretty remote. Jonas froze. That was exactly where he'd found those unfamiliar paw prints month after month. Prints that never led toward town, always turning back into the forest, like someone, or something, had never intended to leave the battlefield, even without a command to follow. That afternoon, as the wind began parting the gray clouds over Halden, Jonas returned to the rescue station, this time carrying the full report on Blitz, a confirmation from the Tennessee K9 Center, and a laminated photo taken during a special operations training. In the image, Blitz stood tall beside a uniformed officer, Elias Thorne, his ears perked, eyes focused, body sharp and sculpted under that deep russet coat. No leash, just presence, just discipline, just trust. They called him a stray, Jonas said, placing the photo onto the wooden desk. But to me, he's part of a vow that was never broken. The night watch officer stared at the picture, then looked up. So, what should we do? Jonas answered without hesitation. We don't need to do anything more than call him by the name that's his. When Blitz was led out of holding, he didn't growl, didn't pull away, didn't bark. He walked behind Jonas slowly, steadily, as if, once again, he had found his place in the line, where his name wasn't just an identifier, but a declaration. And when they reached the glass door leading to the backyard of the station, Blitz paused. He turned his head. Sienna, still holding the still warm folder, caught herself staring into eyes that weren't just seeking shelter, but remembering what it meant to be assigned. We're not bringing him home, she whispered aloud. We're bringing Blitz back to where he never left. But as the pickup truck rounded the corner into Crescent View Medical Center, the gates were already surrounded by over 20 people lined shoulder to shoulder, some holding plastic signs, others with hand-painted boards, red letters bleeding under mist and drizzle. Dangerous to the community. Strays are a threat. Choose children, not dogs. And on the third step of the entrance, elevated above the crowd, stood Edna Vale, clad in a waterproof coat the color of bitter wine, a portable microphone in one hand, and eyes that sliced through rain with a voice sharp enough to drown out thunder. I'm not against kindness, Edna began, her voice clipped and clear, each word falling like the first lines of an indictment. But we cannot place our trust in a creature that appeared with blood on its muzzle at the scene of a rescue operation. Who among us can guarantee that it won't bite another child if startled, if touched the wrong way? Who here is ready to take responsibility if that happens? Inside the examination room, Blitz had been moved into a stainless steel kennel lined with clean folded towels and warmed by a gentle heat lamp. Just outside the glass, Jonas Weller sat in a wooden chair pulled from the back office of the old operations center, one he had used more than 2 decades ago when his uniform still bore the weight of duty and the town still called him Captain. In his hand, he held a photograph, its edges worn, its corners softened by time. A shot of a K9 unit standing side by side, Blitz in the middle, head slightly tilted, ears raised, posture alert, as if waiting for the next command. "You saved the girl," Jonas murmured, the words slipping past his lips like wind brushing the edge of his own ear. "Now it's our turn to save you." The next morning, the petition launched by Edna had gathered nearly 300 signatures. Mayor Weldon, unable to remain silent in the face of rising tension, called for an emergency hearing at Ravenshade Town Hall, 3 p.m. sharp, the notice posted in bold letters on the electric board beneath the fountain at the plaza, right under the town's long-standing motto, "Community, Clarity, Safety." Plastic chairs were arranged in 2 long rows beneath the pine-paneled rafters of the meeting hall. Beneath the flat, sterile lights, people began to gather, some with young children clinging to their legs, some still in uniform, some simply drawn by the curiosity that flares when a town must choose between fear and faith. In the second row sat Sienna, and beside her Claire Jennings, her hair still damp, her eyes hollow from a night spent awake by Mira's hospital bed. Edna stepped up to the podium first. Her voice remained steady, deliberate, unhurried. She repeated the same arguments as before. Even if he was once a trained service animal, he is still a creature who lost control. What happened may have been instinct, not intention, not the result of conscious thought. Some people clapped politely. Others remained still. Then Claire stood up. She didn't ask for the microphone. "The blood on his muzzle," she said, her voice clear, "was from my daughter's knee. A scrape, from gravel, when Blitz held her above the floodwater, and if you doubt that, I have hospital photos. I have the medical report." A rustle of whispers spread from the back row. No one applauded, but no one interrupted either. Just then, the side door to the hall swung open. Jonas entered, carrying a large folder under one arm. "Before we vote," he said, his voice low but firm, "I want you to see this." He held up a map and pointed to the western outskirts, the place where Blitz had disappeared 3 years ago. "I served in the K9 unit for nearly 20 years. I know what it looks like when a soldier is abandoned, and I know what it means when they keep protecting people, even after no one calls their name." A child sitting near the front leaned toward her mother and whispered, "That's the dog who saved my friend." And in that same instant, a voice rose from the main entrance, a voice so familiar to everyone in the room it seemed to shake the air itself, though it had not been heard in over a year. "And I," the voice said, rough but unbroken, "I was the last one Blitz saved. And I'll testify." All heads turned. The man standing at the door was Elias Thorne. And for a heartbeat longer than time should allow, it was as if someone had frozen the entire room so that the image could be engraved in memory with perfect clarity. The old dark uniform still worn like a second skin, the faint scar visible at the edge of his rolled-up sleeve. The face that had once been printed on flyers, pinned across the town police department's missing persons board for nearly a year. And the eyes, weary with distance but steady with resolve. The kind of resolve that made even the doubtful sit up straighter and face their own unease. Mayor Weldon was the first to rise, his voice cracking. "Captain Thorne, we thought—" "I'm not dead," Elias said, cutting him off. Not with anger, but with the kind of finality that made room for no further ceremony. "I'm alive, and Blitz is the only reason why." He stepped forward, one slow stride after another, each footfall echoing in the minds of those who had signed a form out of fear, who had doubted not because of evidence, but because of the absence of understanding, forgetting that loyalty does not always wear a name tag or demand a reward. Sometimes, it simply waits to be seen again with the eyes of gratitude rather than suspicion. Jonas stepped aside. Sienna glanced toward Mira, who sat quietly in her wheelchair, still cradling the faded gray stuffed rabbit her mother had brought from home. Mira looked up, and as Elias drew near, she spoke, softly, her voice trembling but unmistakably clear. "Blitz saved me." No one laughed, no one clapped. Only silence remained. The kind of silence that lingers when grown-ups are reminded that sometimes the simplest thing is also the most right. Claire stepped into the center of the room. "I'm Mira's mother. I'm not here to talk about regulations or policies. I'm here to say that my daughter is alive, and that has nothing to do with protocol. It has everything to do with a creature who never once looked away from her during the storm." Jonas rose again, his hand resting on the back of Sienna's chair. "Blitz is not just a dog. He was once a part of the team that protected this town. We fly flags every year to honor those who served, and now we're ready to discard one of our own. Because he had blood on him during a rescue?" Sienna turned on the projector, and the screen lit up with a grainy clip pulled straight from the archived records. A training session recorded during the final week Blitz had been logged as active. The footage showed him charging through a flaming obstacle course, vaulting debris, dragging a dummy soldier from a simulated wreck still belching smoke. The room fell utterly silent. There was nothing left to justify calling him a stray. Then Mira, now seated in her wheelchair and wheeled gently to the small speaking platform at the center of the room, cleared her throat. "I don't know the law," she began, her voice soft but clear, her dark eyes lifting to meet the crowd gathered before her. "But I know what woke me up after the water covered my face. It was him. No one else. And if you want to blame him for the blood, then that blood was mine, and I'm not mad." No one gasped. But in the third row, several hands reached quietly for tissues. Elias placed a hand gently on Mira's shoulder, saying nothing, because his presence alone was the strongest testimony to what Blitz had done. And when Mayor Weldon finally spoke, "Is there any objection to placing Blitz under temporary witness protection and medical supervision at the town veterinary center?" Not a single hand rose. But just as the hearing adjourned, a smaller meeting was quietly called inside the mayor's office, where a fax had arrived minutes earlier from the Federal Animal Control Bureau. One line of text turned the air from calm to wire-tight. K9 Unit K97 falls under federal oversight due to unresolved classification linked to Operation Storm Vault. Sienna narrowed her eyes, repeating the word aloud. "Storm Vault?" No one answered immediately. Captain Thorne leaned over the meeting table, hands braced against its edge, eyes locked on the smudged text. Jonas glanced at Claire, who had just put Mira to sleep in the rest area behind the hall, then turned back to Sienna, as if waiting for an explanation he already feared wouldn't be simple. Sienna pulled out her phone and accessed the internal clearance system. Stormvault is a 2020 codename, biological weapon development, top-tier classified. No files have been declassified. She looked up. And K97 was listed as part of the asset rotation. Silence settled like fog. "Then why did he end up here?" Claire asked quietly. Elias didn't lift his gaze from the page. "Maybe Blitz never returned to the base because he didn't believe it was safe anymore. Or," Jonas added slowly, "or Blitz is carrying a piece of information that was never meant to vanish." The public vote was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. beneath the vaulted wooden ceiling of the old town hall. The same place that had once hosted county fairs PTA meetings, and mayoral debates from decades past. Blitz sat beside Jonas, ears drooped not from fear, but from fatigue, the kind worn by soldiers who've just stepped off the front line without time to rewrap their wounds. Mira, seated in her wheelchair, her small hand resting on a wooden sign scrawled with the words, "Blitz is my friend," was pushed to the front by Claire. Behind them stood Sienna, her face visibly taut with concern, and Captain Thorne, wearing his old training uniform for the first time in a year, the shoulders now slightly snug, but the silver stripe insignias still shining. Mayor Weldon struck the gavel 3 times. We'll proceed with a vote on 3 options. 1. Submit Blitz to federal custody. 2. Maintain local supervision at the veterinary center. 3. Recognize Blitz as a member of this community under voluntary guardianship. The room held its breath. Ballots were passed out. Old hands, young hands. Even those who had never spoken in public quietly retrieved pens from coat pockets, as though this moment was their chance to rewrite something that had once gone wrong. The screen lit up with the results. Option 3, 64% approval. No one shouted. The applause began quietly, scattered but spread, growing, building, and then bursting. Not like a victory, but like something long overdue finally coming home. Claire stepped into the center of the room. "I'd like to take responsibility for Blitz." She paused. "And I won't be doing it alone." Jonas stepped forward. "You have me." Elias nodded. "And me." A family not built on blood, but on the vow to carry the same promise. Edna Vale, the one who had once led the petition against Blitz, stood silently. She picked up her handbag, turned, and left the hall. No glare, no bitterness, just the quiet posture of someone walking between clapping hands without anyone trying to stop her. As the crowd thinned, Sienna picked up the facts and approached Jonas and Elias. "Stormvault isn't finished. I need both of you to come with me." She handed them a small printed map, an extract from a confidential file. "There's a location just north of the forest marked with a K9 insignia. I think Blitz still remembers the way." Blitz, resting near Mira, suddenly raised his head. His ears stood tall. His eyes turned toward the glass door that now revealed the shadowy outline of forest rimmed in twilight fog. And when the door creaked open and the familiar scent of pine resin filled the air, Blitz rose, not hesitating, not waiting for orders. As if from the moment he'd seen that map, he already knew there was something unfinished waiting underground, waiting for loyal Paws to return and close what was left undone. On the dirt road leading into North Ravenshade's forest, the wheelchair's wheels clicked softly every time they met gravel. Claire pushed Mira forward, her eyes locked on Blitz's pace ahead. Each step firm now, steady, no longer trembling as it once had, but grounded, like he had never been abandoned at all. Jonas held a flashlight, but the early spring light was enough to ease the shadows. Sunlight catching the now clean fur on Blitz's back, revealing its burnished chestnut glow streaked with aging gray, the kind no storm had been able to wash away. Elias walked behind with Sienna, occasionally glancing to the right, where old, towering trunks arched overhead into a natural roof. This had once been the covert training field for his K9 unit, and the memory of it still pulsed beneath the bark. "There," Blitz stopped, lifting his head toward a low mound of earth, a site once built to mimic special operations scenarios. He scraped at the ground. A piece of rotted wood jutted up. Jonas dropped to one knee and pried up the old floorboard. Beneath the dirt, they found a rusted metal box, the edges flaking, but the lock intact. Elias entered a 2-letter code, BZ, Blitz's internal unit identifier from Halden County. Inside was a small notebook, thick paper, each page bearing photos, maps, and one final line scrawled in trembling black ink. If this unit falls, the last one standing will know what to do. No one said anything. The wind rustled gently through the trees, weaving between the branches like the soft exhale of a memory finally unlocked, not to reopen the pain it once carried, but to close it, quietly and truthfully, with the kind of closure only truth can bring. Sienna slipped the notebook back into her coat pocket, turning her gaze to Blitz, who remained perfectly still at the edge of the hall floor, not stepping forward, not stepping back, as if knowing this was not his moment to move, but to be seen. Claire placed a hand gently on Sienna's shoulder. So now, we can go home, can't we? The following morning, just as the spring sunlight stretched across the red brick walkway outside Crescent View Veterinary Center, the back door opened without a creak, as though even the hinges understood they should not disturb the stillness of a moment already becoming something symbolic, something permanent. Blitz stepped out first, his fur clean and dry, the swelling on his hind leg neatly wrapped in soft white gauze, marked faintly with the words, Rescue 03 Clearance, hand-labeled by Dr. Ellen herself, not as a medical tag, but as a quiet acknowledgement that this place was not an end, only a stop on the way back to where he was always meant to be. Claire followed behind, gently guiding Mira's wheelchair, while Jonas walked beside them, cradling in his hand the old leather collar retrieved from the police department's long-forgotten storage room. The collar etched with a single line of worn letters. K97, Blitz, Certified Rescue Unit. The townspeople of Ravenshade had already gathered, leaning against doorways, watching from second-floor windows, standing quietly on porches and sidewalks along the sunlit stretch of Main Street, not with fanfare, not with banners or applause, but with stillness, the kind that says more than noise ever could, the kind that welcomes not with spectacle, but with presence. An elderly woman laid a single peony blossom atop her mailbox. A young boy lifted a hand-lettered sign scribbled in bright markers. You're a hero. Even the auto shop owner, who had once chased Blitz away in the pouring rain just a month before, tipped his cap with a subtle nod, a hand resting on the brim like an unspoken apology folded into the morning air. Mira extended her hand and placed it gently on Blitz's head, the same head that had carried her across rising floodwaters, that had cradled her beneath falling shadows, that had howled 3 times into the storm, not in expectation of a reply, but in pure commitment to being heard. I knew you'd come back, she whispered. Not to Blitz, not to the people lining the street, but perhaps to the long weeks of waiting, to every morning she had walked alone to leave behind a sandwich wrapped in paper and the fragile shape of hope. Blitz turned his head toward her, and in his eyes there was no longer the guarded look of a creature trained to scan for threats, no longer the tension of something waiting for a command, but instead the steady, softened gaze of a soul who had found a reason to remain, not to complete a mission, but simply to exist, to be present exactly where he was most needed. At the gates of Central Park, just beneath the towering maple that had only begun to sprout its first new leaves of the season, the mayor affixed a small brass plaque to a smooth stone. Blitz, the promise keeper in the season of rising waters. Call sign K97, unit, no longer active, never forgotten. And the town didn't erupt in cheer. They didn't clap or shout. They simply stood still. Because sometimes, true gratitude doesn't need to be loud. It only needs a moment of quiet, and the first light of spring to do the rest.